It's your favorite NPC, and in this course I'm going to teach you everything you need to understand PHP. We'll start by setting up your environment, then jump into all the PHP basics, so variables, functions, data types and more. After that, you'll learn how to accept user input and write it into a database, so storing the data, reading the data, updating and deleting it. We'll also cover security, so sessions, cookies, password hashing, validation, sanitization, and everything you need to actually write safe PHP code. We'll finish this course by learning all you need to know about object-oriented PHP. So let's get started, guys. PHP is a popular server-side scripting language used primarily for web development to create dynamic web pages. Unlike client-side languages like JavaScript, PHP code runs on the web server, not in the user's browser. PHP still drives over 75% of all websites that use a server language. Whenever you want to build a website with register, login, or user content, chances are high that you want to use PHP. Let's take a look at an example. When a user, also called the client, opens your website, the browser sends a request to your web server. But what is a web server? A lot of people make this really difficult, but a web server is simply a computer, often located somewhere else in the world. Technically, it could also be your own computer, and you can use your own computer as a web server. But that's usually not a great idea. Websites should be online 24/7 and respond quickly. And keeping your personal computer running all day is neither practical nor reliable. That's why websites normally run on a server provided by hosting companies. These servers are designed to stay online 24/7, or at least that's the idea, and are much faster than a normal PC. Unless you're a millionaire and have a crazy good PC. Your PHP code is stored on these servers, often in huge data centers, and is executed there whenever someone visits your website. PHP now acts as a middleman between the user, so someone who wants to access your website, and the database. It can communicate with both the user and the database, but the user cannot talk directly to the database, and the database cannot directly talk to the user. This separation makes everything much more secure. For example, if a user tries to send malicious input, PHP can validate and sanitize the data first and prevent harmful code from ever reaching the database. The database is usually also stored on a server. It can be the same server that your PHP code is running on, but it can also be a different server. If the user's request is valid though, PHP retrieves the necessary data from the database, generates the HTML, CSS and JavaScript for the page, and sends the final result back to the user's browser, so the user can see it. And the browser only receives the finished web page. It never sees any of the PHP code running behind the scenes. So in simple terms, PHP handles all of the logic on the server and sends the final result to the client. Everything the user sees is the output from PHP, not the PHP code itself. To write PHP code and store data in the database, we need two things: a server that can run PHP and a MySQL database. To get both at once and set up a fully working local environment, we're going to install XAMPP. It includes the Apache web server, which will execute our PHP code, and MySQL right out of the box. We are also going to install a code editor to write our code. I'm going to use VS Code in this course, but feel free to use any editor you like. Let's start by installing XAMPP. We can just type XAMPP into the search bar, press search, and now we can click the first link right here. Right here you can install XAMPP for Windows, Linux or Mac OS. I have a Windows computer, so I'm going to press XAMPP for Windows. Your download will start automatically, but somehow for most of you it probably won't, so you have to click here. And now you will see that my download just started. But if it doesn't for you, then you can just press download latest version right here. Now we're going to wait for this to finish. And once we're done, we can just press this .exe file. It's going to start the installer. Right here you can just press yes. If the installation does not work with your antivirus, you have to pause it for a short time, but for me this worked. Right here, this is the setup. We're going to press next. We are only really going to need MySQL and phpmyadmin, but you can just go ahead and also install everything. That doesn't really matter. Right here you have to select the folder. Usually you want to have it on your C drive, so this folder should be fine. We're going to press next. Next, next, and now we're waiting for the installation to finish. Once finished, you can just press finish right here. So this window right here should open. But let's close this one for now and let me show you how you can also open that. You can also just go to the search bar usually and type in XAMPP. And now you should see your XAMPP control panel. Or you can go to this PC to your local disk. Usually you should have your XAMPP installation right here. And right here you can also scroll to the bottom and just press XAMPP control, and this will also open your XAMPP control panel. Right here you want to start your Apache server as well as your MySQL server. You will see that the service is running if you have this green background right here. And now let's create a project. If you want to create a PHP project and you want this Apache server to recognize your project, you always have to create the project within your htdocs folder. So right here, you can just create a new folder. The folder name is going to be your project name. So I'm going to use the project name NPC, for example. And now if I'm going to type in localhost into the search bar, like so, and I'm going to press enter, you can see that we are getting to this page. So this right here is the starting page. And if you now want to access a specific project, you can use localhost / followed by the name of your project, since the folder name is NPC. And by default, the Apache server is always looking inside of this folder for the project name. We can say localhost / NPC to access this project. So as you can see, we are getting redirected to this page right here. But since we don't have an index.php file inside of this folder, it does not know what the entry point is. So the index.php is always the entry point. In order to create this index.php file, we should first install a code editor. And in our case, let's go back to Google and let's search for Visual Studio Code, because that is going to be the code editor that I am going to use. Just press the first link, download for Windows in my case. Now it's going to download Visual Studio Code. Once downloaded, we can start the installation process by clicking on this file. We have to accept the agreement, next. Make sure that those ones are checked. We're going to press next, install. We are waiting for the installation to finish. Once done, we can press finish. And we are also going to launch Visual Studio Code right here. Visual Studio Code will look pretty similar to this. And now we can open a folder. So we can open this folder right here within Visual Studio Code by pressing open folder. Or we can just take the folder and drag it in right here. And this will automatically open the folder within Visual Studio Code. If we now create an index.php file, we will see that we will now get a result if we reload our localhost NPC page. So as you can see now, we have this blank page. And the reason for this is that this here is a blank page as well. We are going to install one extension that is really important for writing PHP code. So we are going to go to the extensions tab right here. We're going to search for PHP IntelliFans. So right here you see we have PHP IntelliFans. And now you will have an install button and you can just press that button and you're good to go. And this will just give you code completion, display errors, and so on. Again, it's important to understand that the Apache server is running our PHP code. So what you're seeing right here is possible because of the Apache server. And MySQL right here offers us the possibility to create a MySQL database for PHP. We can access the MySQL server by saying localhost / phpmyadmin. And right here you see phpmyadmin, and that allows us to create MySQL databases that we can later on connect to our PHP code. But you'll understand all of this throughout the course. Let's create our first PHP script. To do so, we can click on New File. We can give our file a name. Usually the name is going to be index.php for the entry file. So we're going to press enter. And every single PHP file always has the ending .php. Instead of this PHP file, we can write normal HTML code. We can, for example, use an exclamation mark to create a basic HTML template. And right here, we can just write normal HTML code. To see our site, we can now type in localhost / and after the slash, we need the name of our project. What is the name of our project? The name is NPC. Why is the name NPC? Because the folder name is NPC. So whatever folder name you used instead of this htdocs folder is going to be the name that you have to enter after the localhost. In our case, this is NPC. If the name would be /bro, then you would have to say localhost /bro. To write PHP code instead of a PHP file, we have to use opening and closing PHP tags. By using this opening bracket, $PHP, we are defining an opening PHP tag. Now let's go down, let's create a question mark and this closing bracket, and this defines the closing PHP tag. And inside of those PHP tags, we can now write PHP code. What would be the simplest line of PHP code that we can write? That is probably the echo statement. The echo statement can be used to echo something out. So we can, for example, say we want to echo, hey guys, exclamation mark. You have to end every single statement by using a semicolon. Now we are going to save this line. And as you can see, we're having hey guys right here. So giving out text on your website using echo is really easy. Let's take a look at echo a little bit closer. As we already saw, you can just echo out a normal string, so normal text, by using echo followed by the text, so hello for example. Then we end the statement by using a semicolon, reload the page, and we're getting hello right here. But you can also use echo to just output normal HTML code. So using a paragraph right here, for example, is completely valid. So you just need an opening and a closing tag right here, for example, and this will still work. And as you can see, since we have a little bit of margin by default when using the paragraph to the top, we now have a slightly different result. Now we can also use a class right here. So we can, for example, say class is equal. Now we need single quotes because double quotes instead of double quotes do not work. And now we can, for a class name, for example, define a class name of text. Doesn't really matter though. Now let's also create a style.css file. Let's target our .text class, and let's just say for the font minus size, we're going to use 3rem. Now we also need to include this style sheet instead of the head, so link : CSS. Let's reload the page, and as you can see, we are getting the super big text. So as you can see, we successfully applied this class. So all I really want you to know is that it is completely possible to use this echo tag to output normal HTML code by using PHP. And this is something that we will do a lot later on. Let's understand the structure of a PHP page as well as require and include. The entry point of every single PHP page is the index.php file. Even though we only specified localhost /mpc right here, we are getting the index.php page. So by default, the entry point of our project is the index.php file. We can also create more files by clicking on new file and giving this file a name, like about for example, followed by .php extension to say that this is going to be a PHP file. Again, we can write normal HTML code in here, and we can just output some random text right here. To access this page, we can now enter localhost /mpc, so the folder that we're in right now, followed by the name of the PHP file we want to access. So we want to access our about.php file, and as you can see, we are now getting the code that we have in our about.php file. So again, if we're just going to use this path right here, we are always loading the index.php, and if we specify a specific PHP file, we are loading that file. Something that is special about PHP is that we can create reusable components. So for example, we could create a header.php that we want to use in every single file. And we can, for example, say that we want to have a div right here. And inside of this div, we want to have an anchor tag that, for example, points to our home page. We also want to have contact, and we want to have about, for example. So now we have those three links. And imagine we wanted to use this header on every single page. So we can now, instead of this echo right here, use the include keyword followed by the file that we want to include. Which kind of file do we want to include? We want to include our header.php file. Let's end the statement by using a semicolon, and let's just reload the page right here. And as you can see, we're having this header right here that we included inside of this PHP tag. We can also use the same include statement on our about PHP page. So let's create a PHP tag, opening and closing tag, and we're going to include our header as well right here. Instead of the header file, let's also define routes for this header file. So this is going to point to our index.php file, and about is probably pointing to our about.php file. Now let's click on about, and you can see that we are getting redirected to about.php. Let's click on home. We're getting redirected to our index.php. So navigation seems to work. Now let's also have some different code on both of those pages so we can see a difference. So this is about, and this is home. Let's click on about. You can see we are on the about page now. Clicking home, we are on the home page right now. So by using include, we can include an external file and use it multiple times. So we can reuse the code from one single file. And this is super efficient because you only have to write this code here once, and then you can include it on multiple pages just by using one single line of code. Instead of include, we can also use require. What is the difference? I'm going to reload the page. You can see there is no difference if you take a look at the page, but the difference is that include will only throw a warning if something goes wrong loading this file, whereas require will interrupt the code from executing and throw an error if something goes wrong loading this file. So usually you should use require because you will throw an error if something goes wrong, and most of the times this is the proper way of handling unexpected behavior. There's also the option to use require once. And this will only require this file one single time. So it will check, does this file already exist on this page? If this file already exists, it's not going to load this once again. Otherwise, it is going to load it for the first time. So let's duplicate that line, for example, 3 times. We're going to reload our index.php file, so our home page. And as you can see, we're only getting this footer once. If I'm going to replace require once with require, for example, though, we will load this file 3 times. Even though it already exists, we're going to load it once again and once again and once again, as you can see. Under most circumstances, you want to use require once, because most of the times you only want to require a file once, but from time to time you might want to use a certain file multiple times. If you think about a blog, for example, and every blog post should have the same structure, and you want to require blog post, require blog post, require blog post, and so on, so you want to require multiple blog posts, require might make sense. So it's just important to know the difference, because we will use that later on pretty often. Let's understand variables. You can create a variable by using a $sign followed by a variable name. You can make this variable name up. So this can be this, for example. This could also be where yo, or this could be username. So this doesn't really matter. You can just define this variable name yourself. Now you can use a value for this variable name. Let's say our username is going to be NPC, for example. So let's save this one. And now I'm going to echo out our username. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting NPC right here. Imagine you have a package, for example. Usually you're putting something inside of this package. Now you could give this package to another person. So this person has this package, and if this person wants to know what is inside of this package, so if the person wants to know the value, he has to open the package. And a variable is pretty similar. You have a value, you put this value inside of the variable. If you want to get the value that is stored inside of the variable, you can just access the variable once again, and now you have access to this value that is stored inside of the variable. You could, for example, also store an age inside of a variable. So this could be 24, for example, and now you could echo out your age. So again, you stored the value 24 inside of this age variable, and now you can use this age variable to access this age whenever you want. Let's understand data types and type conversion. If you're defining a variable, for example, like username, and you set this equal to a certain username like NPC, then you have a data type. Even though you do not explicitly state this data type right here, you automatically define the data type by setting this equal to a certain value. And in our case, as you can see, this here is a text. Why is it a text? Because text is usually inside of those quotation marks right here. So if you use starting and ending quotation marks, this is a text. And a text in programming is defined as a string. So this right here is a string. So whenever you see those quotation marks, you know this is going to be a string. And you can also use single quotation marks. And this is the exact same. If you think about an age, for example, this is called an integer in programming, or short int. An int allows you to store whole numbers. So the age, for example. So you could, for example, imagine an age being equal to 118. So we have a pretty old person right here. And this variable age now stores an integer. The next data type that is important is a float, like so. And this allows you to store decimal numbers. If you think about money, for example, let's imagine you have $1.99 left for the entire month. Then this is going to be a decimal number. And in PHP, you say that this is going to be a floating point number. You also have booleans, and a boolean is pretty similar to a light switch. A light switch is either on or off, and a boolean is either true or false. And a boolean can be used to describe all sorts of things. If you think about rain, for example, it is either raining or it is not raining. So rain can either be true or it can be false. Imagine we are having the rain variable, and we can set this one to true, for example. So now it is raining. But it is also possible that rain is equal to false. So this is what you call a boolean in programming. And if you do not want to define a value at all, you can also say that you want to have a null value. Null just means no value. We could, for example, say that the variable isCool is equal to null. So the variable isCool does not have a value yet. Now let's take a look at type conversion. Imagine we are having a num1, which is equal to a string that has the value 14, and a num2 that is going to be equal to maybe 15. So let's save this one and let's echo out num1 plus num2. So we're going to save this, reload the page, and now we're getting 29. So even though this here is technically a string, so text, and this here is a number, so an integer, we're getting the result 29. So even though those are two different data types this seems to work in PHP. And the reason for this is that PHP implicitly converts the string to a number. So it converts this num1 string, so text, to a number, and then adds 14 to 15. So this is implicit typecasting. There's also the option to explicitly cast a type. So imagine we are having num3, for example, and this is equal to 7.99. Now let's echo out num3 right here, so num3. And let's take a look at the result. We're getting 7.99 because that is our value, that is our floating point value. But now we can also cast this value to an integer, for example. And if you think about my definition of integers, I said that an integer is able to store whole numbers as a value. This here is obviously not a whole number. This is a floating point number. So let me reload the page and see what is going to happen. And as you can see, we're now getting 7. So this right here now gets explicitly casted to an integer, so to a whole number. So we're seeing this whole number right here. There's also the option to say bool, for example. So we could reload the page. Now we're getting 1, which is equal to true. We could also say this is a string. We would not see anything, but you get the idea. You can do pretty much anything by using explicit type conversion. And this right here will get useful later on when we work with forms. Let me introduce you to all of the arithmetic operators. We are going to create num1, which is going to be equal to 10, and we are going to create num2, which is going to be equal to 3. Now let's echo out num1 plus num2. Let's refresh the page, and as you can see, we're getting 13. So this is the plus operator. There also exists the minus operator. This one subtracts num2 from num1. You can also use multiplication by using the asterisk, and as you can see, this multiplies num1 times num2. You can divide num1 by num2 and you get this result right here. And you can use the modulus operator. And this one might be unfamiliar to some of you, so I'll explain this one. If you take a look, we're getting the result 1. And the reason for this is that this is going to take num1, it's going to divide num1 by num2. So 10 divided by 3 is going to be 3. But as you can see, it doesn't really work without using decimal places. So if you keep a rest, 10 divided by 3 is going to be 3, rest 1. And this modulus operator will display the rest. So it will display the 1. Then I'm going to use 11 right here, for example. We will have a rest of 2. So this one will display 2 as a rest. There also exists the possibility to increment one number. So you could, for example, say that num1 is going to be equal to num1 plus 1, for example. So now we incremented number 1 by 1. And now let's just add those numbers. So now we have 12 plus 3, so we'll get 15 as you can see. But there's also a shorter syntax, and you can achieve the same result by using plus plus. As you can see, we're still getting the same result. You can also use minus minus. Now we're getting 13. So plus plus adds 1 to the number, whereas minus minus subtracts 1 from the number. Now you can also say that you want to set number 1 equal to number 1 plus 10, for example. And now we're getting this as a result. And again, there is a shorter syntax to achieve the exact same thing. We can say num1 plus equals 10, for example. And this is equal to saying num1 is equal to num1 plus 10. And as you can see, we're still getting the same result. We can also say minus equal, and this will subtract 10. You can also use multiplication by using the asterisk equals, and we're getting this result. And you can also use division right here, and you're getting this result. Let me introduce you to if statements. An if statement works exactly the same as it would in reality. Imagine we are having a class, and the class can either be hero or villain. So you're either a hero or a villain. So now we could create a variable that is going to be equal to hero. If you are a hero, then this is going to be true. Otherwise, this is going to be false. Now let's imagine we are a hero. So hero is equal to true. Now we can check whether we are a hero or not. And if we are a hero, then we can, for example, print out we are a hero. If we are not a hero, so else, we can print out you are not a hero, for example. And we can write the exact same thing instead of PHP. So now let's say if hero is equal to true, then we're going to echo out hero, and else we're going to echo out villain. So now let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting hero right here. So we are a hero. But if hero is going to be false, then we are going to get villain, because now we are not a hero, so we have to be a villain. But now this also works with strings, for example. So we could, for example, say if hero is going to be equal to hero, then we are a hero. Let's say we can also be a villain, for example, or we can, for example, be nothing. So now we would have 3 potential values. So we can say if hero is equal to hero, for example, then we'll echo out hero. Else if hero is going to be equal to villain, then we are going to echo out villain. And else we are just going to echo out nothing, for example. So now let's take a look. Let's reload the page and we're getting nothing because we are nothing right now. If we're going to use hero right here and we'll reload the page, we're getting hero. And if we're going to use villain right here, we're getting villain. So how does an if statement execute? You're always going to start by using the if keyword. Then you have opening and closing brackets like those, and you have a condition inside of those brackets. So whatever you have in here is the condition. If this condition is equal to true, then you're going to execute whatever you have inside of this body. If this condition is not equal to true, then we are going forward to the next statement. The next statement in our case is else if. It could also be an else statement. If it is an else if statement, then we're again going to check, or we again have to check for a condition. So we again need opening and closing brackets that contain a condition. If the condition right here is true, we are again going to execute the body. And once we execute one of those bodies, one of those statements, so once a condition becomes true, we'll execute the body to the corresponding condition and we break out of the statement. So if this condition is going to be true, we'll execute this body and we stop. If this is not going to be true, we are going to go further down inside of this if statement to the next block. This is the else block, and the else block will always be executed if none of the other blocks were true. So if you want to use a condition, you have to use if this is the start of your if statement, or else if for every other condition you want to add. If none of those conditions becomes true, then you can add an else block, and inside of those brackets you can just define what you want to execute if none of the other conditions are true. So this is how an if statement works. Now you already saw those comparison operators. Let me introduce you to some conditional operators that you'll need when working with if statements. We are having a number right here that is going to be equal to 10, and now we are going to check if our number is equal to 10. If that is the case, then we are going to echo out our number, for example. Let's reload, and as you can see, we're getting 10 inside of the console. So now let me turn this into a string right here, and you can see that we're not getting any output. So why is that? The reason for this is that using 3 equal signs right here checks for strict equality. So the value has to be the exact same, but the data type also has to be the exact same. Since the value seems to be the same here, but we have a different data type, so we have a string right here, this does not work. If I'm going to use 2 equal signs though, you can see that we are getting 10 as an output, so this statement seems to be true. So 1 equal sign is assignment, 2 equal signs is comparison, 3 equal signs is strict comparison. And you always have to make sure that 1 equal sign should only be used for assignment. Now let's turn this into a 10, for example, and let's use the greater operator. Let's refresh this page. And as you can see, we're not getting any result at all because our number, so the number 10, is not greater than 10. If this number is bigger than this number, this one will be equal to true, and we are going to echo out our number. Now we can also use greater or equal to, and this is going to be true because 10 is equal to 10. And since we're checking for greater or equal to 10, this is going to be true and we'll echo out this number. There also exists less than, less or equal to, and not equal to. So if our number is not equal to 10, for example, we'll print this out. Otherwise, we're not going to print anything out. So this is essentially the not operator. And if we are going to use 11 right here, you will see that we'll print out 10 because our number 10 is not equal to 11. Now there are some more important operators that I want to show you. So you can also include multiple expressions right here. So let's, for example, say we are having the hero variable, which is going to be equal to true. So we are a hero, and we have the rain variable, and that one is going to be equal to true. So now maybe we want to check whether we are a hero and whether it is raining. We can do so by saying if hero is going to be equal to true. So I can use this syntax, but you can also leave this equal true statement. And this right here is equivalent to saying hero is equal to true. So if we are a hero and rain is equal to true, so if hero is true and rain is true, then we want to echo out you are a wet hero, for example, for whatever reason. So let's reload. And as you can see, we are a wet hero. if you're using this AND operator, both of those statements need to be true in order to execute the body. So if only one of those things is going to be true and the other one is going to be false, then this one here is going to be false and we will not see anything. So when using the AND operator, both of those statements right here need to be true. But there also exists the OR operator. And if you use the OR operator to concatenate two statements, then only one of those statements has to be true in order for the entire expression right here to become true. So if one of those statements is going to be true, we will execute this echo statement. So you can see you are a wet hero. And even if rain is going to be false, we will still get you are a wet hero. And obviously this doesn't really make too much sense. So in this case, you could say you are either wet or a hero. So this would make a little more sense, like so. So now we have you are either wet or a hero. So now the statement also makes sense. Imagine we are having this if statement right here for a pretty simple task. So for every single bicep size, we just want to output some text. And it would be a possible solution to just write this super long if statement. But for this scenario, it might make more sense to use a switch statement. So you can again use the keyword switch. Right after the switch statement, again, you have a condition right here that you're checking for. In our case, the condition will be our biceps size. So we're going to use this bicep size variable that we defined right here to check for certain cases, as you name them, inside of a switch statement. So you can define different cases right here. You say case, after case, so after this case keyword, you define the value for this specific case. So let's say, for example, if we have a value of 1, for example, then we want to echo out small biceps, for example. So this is our first case. Now we might have a second case, for example, case 2, for example. And in this case, we are also going to echo out still a small biceps, for example. Now we're going to have another case, so case 3, for example, and we'll echo out okay. And case 4 is going to be echo nice, for example. So now we're having this bicep size right here, but let's say we are going to have a bicep size of 4, for example. We're going to reload, and as you can see, we're getting nice right here. So this seems to work. Let me also use 1 right to show you that this here does not work as intended. And as you can see, we're getting all of those values right here. And the reason for this is that after a statement, the code keeps executing. And the reason for this is that we're going to check for bicep size. We are having the first case, so we'll execute this code, but we never say that we want to stop this code from executing. So it goes to the second case, executes, third case, executes, and the last case executes as well. So we somehow need to say, after executing one of those cases, we want to break out, so we want to stop the rest of the switch statement from running. So we have to use a break statement, like so. So most of the times you define a break statement after using those cases. You don't have to use a break statement if you also want to execute the other tasks, but most of the times you will use a break statement because most of the times you don't want to execute the other cases. So now, as you can see, again, I'm going to reload the page and we are only getting small biceps. And after echoing out this right here, we are breaking out of this statement. But what if I'm going to use 5 right now? Now we're not getting anything. And the reason is that we don't have a case for number 5. So there's also the possibility to define a default statement. And this one is similar to defining an else statement. So if none of those cases are equal to true, then we have this else or default statement, which is just going to say, wait, what, for example. So if we don't get a valid size, we're just going to echo out, wait, what. And as you can see, now we're getting wait, what, because our bicep size is 5 and does not equal case 1, 2, 3, or 4. And this is a switch statement in PHP. Let me introduce you to loops. The first loop I want to show you is the while loop. Imagine we are having a number, for example, and this number is going to be equal to 0. Now we want to create a while loop, so we say while our number is less than 10, for example. We want to echo out, hey bro. So how does this while loop work? We are always going to start by using this while keyword right here. Then, instead of those brackets, again, we're having a condition. This loop will run as long as this condition is true. So, while our number is less than 10, we're going to echo out, hey bro. So we will have a first iteration. During the first iteration, we are going to check whether our number is less than 10. Our number for the first iteration is 0. 0 is less than 10. So we are going to execute this body right here will echo out, hey bro. After we executed this loop, we're again going to the beginning of this loop. We're again checking, is our number less than 10? If our number is less than 10, then we are going to echo out, hey bro, once again. And as you can see, at the moment, we will go back to the beginning, echo out, hey bro, once again, because this condition is true again, and we just loop forever and ever. So we're never going to get out of this loop because our number will never be greater than 10. So in order to get out of this loop after a certain amount of iterations, we have to say that we are going to increment our number by 1, for example, but you could also increment the number by 5. So that is up to you. So you can define the logic for this while loop within this body. And again, let me show you, we are now getting, hey bro, 10 times, for example. Now you can define whatever condition you want inside of those brackets, and you can increment this number by whatever value you want inside of the body, for example. So we could also say plus equal 3, for example. And now you can see we will only get hey bro 4 times. But what if our number is going to be 11 from the beginning? So this condition is never going to become true. Let me show you. Right now we are not getting any output because this condition is never equal to true. If you want to make sure that a while loop runs at least once, you can use a do while loop. So you have the do right here. You're going to remove the condition right here. You are just going to have the body right here. So this body will execute. And then you'll add the while condition after the body instead of those brackets right here. So it's pretty similar again, but writing the do while loop is a little bit different. So let me execute that one. And as you can see, we're getting hey bro once, even though this condition is never true. The reason for this is that for the do while loop, we're going to do whatever we have inside of those brackets first, and only after we executed this body one single time, then we are going to check for the while condition. If the while condition is true, then we are going to go to the beginning of the loop and run this body once again. But if the condition is not true, then we're just going to break out of the loop at this point. So while loop first checks for the condition, while the do while loop first executes the body and then checks for the condition. An alternative to the while loop is the for loop. The syntax for the for loop is a little bit different. So let's say, in order to create a for loop, you're going to use the for keyword. And now you have your value, your condition, as well as your increment right here. So first off, you have an initial value right here. Then you have a semicolon, then you have your condition, and then you have your increment last. And again, you have a method body inside of those curly brackets right here. And whatever you want to do will belong inside of those brackets. So our initial value could, for example, be a variable that can have the name I, but the name doesn't matter, it's up to you. And oftentimes you initialize this variable with the value of 0. So now our value I is equal to 0. What is our condition? Let's say we want to run this loop 10 times. Then we'll execute this loop as long as I is less than 10 in our case. And we're going to increment after every single iteration our I value by 1. So I plus plus. Now let's echo out our value I, for example. Let's run the code. And as you can see, we're getting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So just the value of I. There's also the option to have a nested loop, for example. So instead of a for loop, you can also have another for loop. So we could, for example, say for, but we cannot use the same variable name right here. So again, we need a variable name. What can be our variable name? Doesn't really matter, but a convention again is to use j for an inner loop. J can be 0 again. And we're going to run this inner loop as long as j is less than 3, for example. And after every single iteration, we are going to increment j by 1, for example. Instead of this loop, we can now echo out j. This doesn't really matter too much. So let's execute this one. And as you can see, we're getting all of those numbers. So what is happening right here? We are first executing the outer loop. The outer loop has a value I that is equal to 0. The condition is therefore true, and we are going to execute the body of this for loop. Instead of the body, we have another for loop. So we have to execute this for loop. We are having j right here. J is equal to 0. We're going to execute this loop as long as j is less than 3. So we are echoing out j. We are getting to the end of this loop. We're going to the beginning. Now j is 1. Is 1 less than 3? 1 is still less than 3. So we are going to echo out j once again. And this keeps going and going up to the point where we get to j being equal to 3. So at this point, j is not less than 3. So we are not going to echo out j. And we go on to the next line. The next line is the end of the initial for loop. So we're going to jump to the first iteration. Now for this loop, I is 1. 1 is less than 10. So we're going to execute this body once again. Instead of this body, we are again having a for loop. We will initialize j with 0 once again. and we're going to execute this loop once again. So we will execute the outer loop 10 times, and we will, for every single I value of the outer loop, execute the inner loop 3 times. And therefore we are getting 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2 for every single I value. Let me introduce you to functions in PHP. To create a function, you have to use the function keyword followed by the name of the function. So this name is pretty free, so you can use whatever you want right there, but it might make sense to use a descriptive name. In our case, we maybe want to say hello to the user, for example. After the function name, you use opening and closing brackets, and afterwards you have another pair of curly opening and closing brackets. Inside of those brackets, you define what you want to do when you call this function. Imagine, in our case, we just want to echo out hello bro, for example. So now we can just call this function by using the name of the function, followed by opening and closing brackets, and we have to end the statement by using a semicolon. I'm going to reload this code, and as you can see, we now see hello bro. So why is a function useful? We could also just go ahead and echo out hello bro right here. And this would do the exact same as you see. The purpose of a function is, if you think about a function that maybe has a lot of lines, maybe like this. If you wanted to use the same function twice, for example, we would have to use all of this code, paste it in here. If you wanted to use the same code a second time, we would have to paste it in here once again. And as you can see, this looks pretty terrible, and it's not really a clean way to write code. So the alternative is you can just create a function which defines what you want to do once, and then you can call this function as often as you want and execute the entire code. So I can use say hello 4 times, for example, and now you're just executing this function 4 times by only using one single line of code. So let's take a deeper look at functions. You always start by using function keyword followed by the name, and then you have those brackets. What are those brackets for? Inside of those brackets, you can define a parameter or multiple parameters. Why would you like to use a parameter? Right now this function is pretty basic and you don't really have the option to change a lot of things, and to make this really useful, it might make sense to, for example, say that we're getting a username from the user. Since we probably have millions of users inside of our app, saying hello bro every single time would not really make too much sense. It would make more sense to say hello NPC, for example, if the username is NPC, or hello Philip if the username is Philip. So how can we adjust that? We can just use a parameter right here, so the username parameter. Then we are going to use this parameter. After the hello, we can concatenate hello dot username. So this right here says append the username to hello, to the string hello, and then echo it out. So right now we have to pass an argument in here. So when you define the variable instead of the function definition, this is called a parameter. And once you define the value right here, so the specific value, this is what you call an argument. But knowing the difference is not really that important. So as an argument, we can now pass, for example, NPC in here. And now we can say hello NPC. If I wanted to call the same function once again, but with a different username, I can do so by saying gabak, for example. So now we have hello NPC and hello gabak. We could also add an age right here. We could also add is cool here and a lot of other things. So you can add as many parameters as you want, but you also have to add them right here if you defined the parameter right here. Imagine we would have an age, for example. You can see that we are now getting an error because we did not define an age for our function call right here. But we can also use a default value if you wanted to, of 28, for example. And now, as you can see, we don't have this error anymore. If we don't specify anything for the age, we are getting 28. If we specify something, we are going to use that value. So this is a default value. So now we could also just add the age, for example. This will obviously look pretty weird, but as you can see, we're getting hello NPC 26, hello gabak 28. So gabak has 28 because he did not specify a specific value, whereas our NPC user has 26 because he specified 26 as the age. So to sum up, you create a function by using the function keyword, followed by the function name that you can make up yourself, followed by a list of parameters that you want to use. You don't have to define parameters though, followed by the function body where you define what the specific function is going to do. If you call the function, you have to use the function name, followed by opening and closing brackets. If you specify parameters in your function definition, you have to pass them as arguments into your function call. And this is all you really need to understand functions in PHP. Let's understand arrays in PHP. To create an array, you can just use a normal variable name. Those can be our heroes, for example, followed by opening and closing brackets. So this variable, heroes, is equal to an array. All of the items of an array are going to be listed inside of those brackets right here. So our first hero can, for example, be Goku, while our second hero can, for example, be Patrick, and our third hero can, for example, be Saitama. So what is an array? An array is essentially just a list. And inside of this list, we just listed a couple of heroes in this case. Let's just echo out our heroes and see what is going to happen. So as you can see, we're getting this warning right here. So how can we output one of those elements, for example? We can use opening and closing brackets again, followed by a number. Now we're getting Goku. Why does heroes of 0 output Goku? Every element inside of an array has a number that allows you to access the specific element. And when working with arrays, you start with the number 0. So Goku, so the first element inside of an array, has the index number 0, 1, 2. So you don't start with the number 1, but instead you start with the number 0 when working with arrays. So this is really important. So if you want to get the first element, you have to access heroes of 0. If you want to get the second element, you have to use heroes of 1. And if you want to get the third element, you have to use heroes of 2, for example. So now we're getting Saitama. So again, by using those opening and closing brackets, you can define an array, and you can access the elements inside of this array by using the array name, followed by opening and closing brackets, and inside of those brackets you just specify the index number, starting with the number 0. Now there also exists something that is called an associative array. An associative array is a little bit like objects or maps in other programming languages, but let me just show you. Let's think about a user, for example. And this user, for example, has a username, an age, power level, whatsoever, doesn't really matter. So inside of this associative array, we can now specify a key and a value. Our keys need to be inside of quotation marks, so our key can be the username, for example. Now we're going to use an arrow, like so, and after this arrow we have to specify the value. In this case, the value can, for example, be NPC. Maybe our user also has a password, so PVD. Let's say this password is big biceps. So now we have a username and a password, and maybe we also want to get a power level, for example. Let's say our power level is 1. So now we have this user right here stored inside of this associative array. And I can already tell you, if you work with a database later on, this is like really similar. So this is pretty much exactly what is going on when you work with a database later on. You're getting an associative array like this that includes all of the user data. And now we can access this user data by using, again, the name of our associative array, followed by those brackets. And inside of those brackets, we have to define the key that we want to access. In our case, we might want to access our username. So now we can output our username. Let's remove our echo of heroes and let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're right here outputting our username. We can also say that we want to output our PVD, for example. It does not make any sense at all. Usually you would never want to output a password, but in this scenario, let's say we want to do that. And as you can see, this works as well. So to sum up, you have normal arrays and associative arrays. To access a normal array, you will use the array name, followed by opening and closing brackets, and inside of those brackets you will have an index that uniquely identifies each of those items. And if you want to access an associative array, you have to specify the key by using the key name right here. Now there's also a super important function that you should remember when working with arrays, and that is going to be the for each method that allows you to loop over an array. Imagine we wanted to loop over our user, for example, and we can say that we want to get our key and we also want to get our value, like so. And now let's just echo out our key. Let's save that one. And as you can see, we're getting username, PVD, and power level. So by using a for each loop, you can loop over the keys and the values of an array. So you always start a for each loop by using the for each keyword. Right here, you have opening and closing brackets, and inside of those brackets, you first define the name of the array. Then you use the as keyword, and right here you can, for example, get the key and the value, and then echo out the key. You could also echo out the value if you wanted to. So that is up to you. And you can implement pretty much any logic you want to implement right here. So you could modify those values, just print them out, and so on. You could also loop over a normal array. So we can, for example, again say for each. In our case, we're not having an associative array right now. So we're having the heroes array. So we're going to say heroes. as hero. The name doesn't really matter too much. And now we can just echo out the hero. Let's save that. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting all of those heroes. And let me just delete that one right here. So now we're getting Goku, Patrick, and Saitama. So again, we have the array name right here. And right here, we define the name, the variable name that we'll use for every single item for every single iteration. So this for each loop is just a for loop essentially that loops over an array, for example. And for every single iteration, this hero variable holds another value of heroes. So for the first iteration, hero holds the value Goku. It's going to echo out Goku, goes into the second iteration. For the second iteration, hero holds the value Patrick, prints it out, and so on, until it iterated over every single value inside of this array. Now we can also add a break by using a break element. And as you can see, now we have this break right here, and we can see all of those elements one after another. Now let's just remove this associative array and let's focus on some array functions that we can use to manipulate our array, because that is something that might be important. From time to time, you maybe want to count the amount of elements that you have inside of an array, and you can do so by using the count function. Inside of this count function, you have to specify the array of which you want to count the elements. So in our case, we want to count the elements of our heroes array. So let's save that one. Let's echo that out. And as you can see, we are getting 3 right here. And let me just place this break statement right before our hero, so this looks a little bit better. So now this is the result. We're getting 3 elements right here. If I'm going to add another element, doesn't really matter. We can see that we now have 4 elements inside of this array. Now obviously we could just add an element by typing an element in here, but we can also use the array push method to push an element to the end of an array. So array underline push. Now we need to define the array to which we want to push an element to. So in our case it's heroes again, like so. And now after a comma, we need to define the values. In our case, we might want to add gabak to the end of this heroes array. Let's save that one. Let's reload. And as you can see now, we have gabak at the end of this array. So array.push takes whatever value we defined right here and pushes this value to the end of the specified array. So we'll append this one right here. We can also use array underline pop and call it like this. Now we also need to specify the array of which we want to pop an element. We're going to reload, and as you can see, now gabak is gone. And the reason for this is that array underline pop takes the last element and pops it, so removes it from the array. We can also get this element though by saying that we want to store the popped element inside of maybe popped hero, for example. So inside of this variable. And now let's just say that we are going to echo our popped hero. Let's save that one, and we need to remove one of those $signs. And as you can see, now we're getting gabak right here. And I can also append popped hero right here. So we see that this is in fact the popped hero, as you can see. So array push pushes an element to the end of an array. Array pop takes an element, removes it from the end of an array, and you are able to store the popped element inside of a variable if you wanted to do so. There's also shift and unshift for arrays. So array underscore shift, for example. Now we need to specify the array. Let's say it's the heroes array once again. We're going to save that one. Let's execute the code. Heroes with an S. Let's execute. And as you can see, now Goku will not be listed right here anymore. So shift removes the first element of an array. Now we also have the option to use array underscore unshift. And this does the exact opposite. You specify an array, so heroes, for example, and you specify the values. So first, for example, in this case, let's save this, let's execute, and as you can see now, we have first as a first element of our array. So unshift takes the values and appends them to the front of an array. So it places them as the first element inside of this array. So to summarize, array underline push pushes to the end of an array, array underline pop pops the last element of an array underline shift pops the first element of an array underline unshift adds an element to the beginning of an array. Let's understand strings and string functions in PHP. Let's create a variable username that is equal to NPC, for example. So by using those quotation marks, we are creating a string. But now we also have the option to use multiple string functions to, for example, manipulate the string. or get some information about the string. The first one is string length, so strlen, to get the length of a certain string. In our case, let's get the length of username. We're going to save that, and we are going to echo out the length of our string. Let's reload the page, and we're getting 3 because we have 3 characters inside of the string. Then I'm going to add more characters. We will get a different length. We can also use the string to lower function right here, and this will convert everything to lowercase. So now we're getting NPC and a random word. We can also use string to upper right here, and this will convert everything to uppercase. So now we have this string right here. We can also use str replace to replace certain characters inside of a string. So right here as the first argument, we have to add what we are searching for. Let's say in our case, we are searching for an n. We want to replace an n, for example, with a p for whatever reason. And now we have to specify the string for which we want to execute this operation. And in our case, it's the username string. Let's save that one. Let's execute. And as you can see, we are now getting ppc because we replaced the n with a p. We can also say that we want to output a certain substring. So we can use substring, for example, so substr. Now we need to specify the string. In our case, it's username once again. Where do we want to start? We want to start, for example, at character 0. What is the length? Let's say the length is 3 characters. So let's save that one. And we're getting NPC. Let's do 5 characters, for example. And we're getting NPCs. So we're starting at index 0. This is index 0. And we're going forward by 5 characters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're ending right here. So we're getting everything up to this point. So substring allows you to create a substring out of an existing string. We can also search for the position of a certain character. So we can say strpos for string position. Now we need to specify the string and we need to specify what we're looking for. Let's say we are looking for the character s. Let's save that one. And we are getting the number 4 because the position of our first s is position number 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's search for n, for example. Let's reload. And we're getting, and this has to be an uppercase n, so this is case sensitive. And we're getting 0. So this character 0, character 1, character 2, 3, and this character 4. 5, 6, 7. Let me introduce you to one function that will be really important later on, and that is the trim function. So we can, for example, pass the username right here, and now we're going to trim our username. So if we have a lot of white spaces later on, we might not want to save those white spaces to the database because that might not make too much sense for a username or an email, for example. And by using the trim method, we can remove those white spaces right here, and therefore later on when we work with a database, for example, store a trimmed string inside of the database, which might make more sense. Let me introduce you to some math functions. We have this number right here that can be equal to -10, for example. To get the absolute value, we can use abs followed by brackets, and inside of those brackets, we can now specify a value. So let's just use the absolute value of our number and display that one by using echo right here. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting 10. So abs gets you the absolute value without the sign of a certain value. And if you remove the sign of -10, you're getting 10. So the value is 10. Now you can also use max right here to get the maximal value out of 2 numbers. So I can, for example, say, get me the max out of 1 and 2, for example. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting 2. Give me the maximum value of 10 and 2, for example, and we're getting 10 right here. We can also get the minimal value by using min right here. Let's refresh, and now we're getting 2 because 2 is less than 10. We can also round a certain value by using the round function. So now let's input a value of 3.4, for example. And as you can see, this rounds it down to 3. If we're going to use 3.6, for example, this will round it up to 4. If we always want to round down, we can use floor. And as you can see, this rounds down even though we are at 3.6. And we can also use ceil. In this case, this will round up, but even if we are having 3.4, we are still going to round up. So ceil for rounding up and floor for rounding down. We can get the square root of a certain number by using sqrt, and now let's, for example, say 16. The square root of 16 is 4, and as you can see, we're getting 4 right here. Let me also show you 32, for example. just to show you that this works and we're getting this number. We can also use pow to raise one number to the power of another one. So let's, for example, say we want to have 2 power 3. Let's save that one and we're getting 8 because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. Let's get a random number between 1 and 10 by using rand. 1 is the minimal value, 10 is the maximal value. Let's save that one. We're getting 5, 8, 8, 4, and so on. And this here is min, and this one is max. So we can also say 100, and now we will get numbers between 1 and 100. If you wanted to get pi, you could also use pi opening and closing brackets and just put that out. And as you can see, we're now getting pi as a value right here. If you have an exception, for example, and you do not do proper error and exception handling, your PHP script, who is under normal circumstances running on a server, will just terminate and therefore interrupt the entire request from the user, for example. So usually if you want to execute code that could potentially result in an error, like creating a connection to a database, then you always want to use a try-catch block. So let me show you. You create a try-catch block by using try as a keyword, followed by those brackets right here. Inside of those brackets, you just write the code that you want to execute. So you want to try to execute this code inside of this block. In our case, we could, for example, say that we want to try to divide 10 by 0, which obviously doesn't work. So this will result in an error. So now we also need to catch that one in case we're getting one. So we need to define a catch block. And in our case, we might get an error. So we want to have a throwable of type E. And we again need those brackets right here. This right here is an object. We did not really understand objects at this point, but you don't really need to understand too much at this point. Just know this is an object. An object can have properties and methods itself. So this is just an error object that contains a lot of information about the specific error. So we could just echo out this error. And now we want to get the message, so the specific error message in our case, to access certain properties or methods of an object. We can use an arrow. Now we can access a method or a property by using the method or property name. In our case, we want to get the getMessage method of this object and just echo that one out. Let's refresh the page and we're getting division by 0 right here. So that was the error. We could also just define something like didn't work, bro. We could refresh and now we're getting didn't work, bro. So you use a try-catch block to try something that can potentially go wrong, as I mentioned, like connecting to a database or trying to write into the database. So all of that can potentially go wrong. And then you define the catch block where you define what you want to do if something goes wrong. So if something inside of the try block results in an error. You can also get as a parameter right here the error object that will give you some specific information about the error. And you can use this error object to, for example, display the user specific information about the error. But that's up to you, obviously. Let's understand cookies and sessions. When you log into a normal website, you usually enter something like your email and password. These credentials are sent to the server, validated, and if they are correct, the server creates a session for that user. A session is basically a small package of information stored on the server. Things like the user ID, the username, or whatever the website needs to remember about you while you're logged in. Every session also has a unique session ID. Now, here's the important part. The server does not send the whole session back to the user. It only sends the session ID. And that session ID gets stored in a cookie inside of the user's browser. That cookie is tiny. Usually just something like session ID is equal to a random string. It doesn't contain any personal data. It's just a key. If you think about websites like Instagram, you don't have to log in every time you click on a new page or reload the site. That's because the browser automatically sends the cookie and therefore the session ID along with every single request. The server then looks at the session ID sent within the cookie, checks whether there is a matching session stored on the server, and if it exists, the server immediately knows who you are and that you are logged in. As long as the cookie with that valid session ID exists, you stay logged in without doing anything. But cookies also have expiration dates. Once the cookie expires, the browser stops sending the session ID and the server can't link you to your session anymore, which means you need to log in again and generate a fresh session and therefore a fresh cookie. Critical applications like banking platforms keep these sessions very short-lived. Because if someone steals your cookie, they could act as you for as long as the cookie is valid. For platforms that are less sensitive, like social media, sessions can last much longer. That's the entire idea. The session lives on the server, the cookie lives in the browser, and the session ID connects both. Without the cookie, you'd have to log in on every single request. Let's understand superglobals in PHP. And superglobals are just associative arrays instead of PHP that will be given to you by PHP. So those are built-in associative arrays that you can access if you wanted to. And there exist a lot of different superglobals. Let's start by understanding the get superglobal. In order to use the get superglobal, let's first of all create a form of type get. Now, this form attribute needs an action, and this action defines which PHP file we are going to execute once this form will be submitted. And in our case, we want to execute this PHP code, so we have to use our index.php for the action. So index.php, because this is the file that will be executed once we submit. So let's also create an input of type text, and we can imagine that this input field is for our username. So the name is going to be username. We are also going to add a submit button, so a button of type submit that will have the text submit, for example. Doesn't really matter too much. Now, as you can see, we are sending a get request. And by using this get request, we are sending the input field that has the name username. So how can we get the value of this username right now? By using a superglobal, to be precise, by using the get superglobal. Now, to access this value, we can use the get superglobal. Every single superglobal starts with a $sign and an underline, like so. And right here you can already see a lot of superglobals. So we have the cookie superglobal, files, get, post, request, and so on. In our case, we want to use the get superglobal. And as I already mentioned, this is an associative array. And how can we access values inside of an associative array? We can use the bracket notation followed by the key name inside of those brackets. The key name is the name that we've defined inside of this input element. So in our case, it's going to be username. If this one right here would be pvd, for example, would have to access underline get of pvd, for example. But in our case, it's username, so I'm going to use username. So the name field is always going to specify the key that will be used inside of the associative array. Every value will be stored inside of the superglobal get right here, and we can access the value like so. So now let's just echo this value out. So echo underline get of username. And as you can see right now, we're getting this warning because we don't have a username yet. So right now, this username key is empty for our get superglobal variable. So let's just enter this value. Let's submit. And as you can see, now we're echoing out this value right here. So there exist a lot of different superglobals like underline get, underline post, env, and so on. And if you think about the get superglobal variable, that one looks like this, for example. You have this associative array, you have a username right now, and then you have a certain value for this username. And this is how this superglobal looks. And if you add another input element, for example, and this is going to be pvd, then this associative array will also have the pvd key, and there will also be a value on submission. So every superglobal variable is just built in PHP and helps you with doing a certain task. So the get superglobal helps you by getting form data that has been submitted by using the get method. And as you probably already know, if you use the get method, that is not really secure or not really a secure way to submit data. So if you have data that needs to be secure, like a password, for example, don't use the get method, because I could also submit this form by just saying username is going to be equal to hello. So now I've submitted the form with the value hello. And as you can see, we can also see our values instead of the URLs. So that is of course not secure at all. So we can fix that by using a post request. If we want to get data submitted by using the post request, we have to use underline post instead of underline get. So let me delete the pvd right here. And now again, let's submit this form. And as you can see, we are getting this value right here, but right now we don't have any value inside of the URL. So this is a secure way to submit data to your server and store it over there. Now we also have the cookie superglobal variable that allows us to access our cookies. So let me show you. We can see all of our cookies by right-clicking the page, followed by inspect. Now we can go to our application tab right here. And right here we have this cookies tab. We also have local storage, session storage, extension storage, and our cookies. And right here you can see we have this URL, which is our current page. So we can click this URL. And right now we don't have any cookies right here because we didn't set a single cookie yet. We can set a cookie inside of PHP by using setCookie. Now we need to define a name for our cookie, as you can see. The name can, for example, be lang, but this is up to you. So you can choose any name you want. You can also set a value. Again, this can be anything you want. I'm going to use DE, for example, and I need to define an expiration date. In our case, let's say it's our current time plus 60 times 60, so 1 single hour, times 24. So this cookie is going to be valid for 1 day from this time on. Let's save this one. Let's again reload our page. We're getting this cookie right now that has the name lang, the value DE, because that was the value that we've set, and expires is also over here. Now we can access this cookie if we wanted to by using the cookie superglobal variable. We can check if underline cookie of the name, so the cookie name, because again, this is an associative array. This here's the key, this here's the value. So if underline cookie of lang is equal to DE, so if the value of lang is DE, if that is the case, then we want to echo out German page, for example. Let's save that one. Let's reload the page, and as you can see, we are getting German page, because this cookie is set. Let's understand the session superglobal variable. And you will usually use a session to store data inside of a session. So you can, for example, store the login status within the session variable and so on. You can access the session variable by using session followed by those brackets again. Now we can, for example, add a key value pair to our session associative array by saying user underline ID, and let's say this one is equal to just a random user ID. Doesn't matter. We just made this one up. This is obviously not how it would normally work. And now let me echo out our session user underline ID variable, and let's see what is going to happen. And as you can see, we are able to access the session within the same page. Something that is really good about a session is that you can also access the session on all of your pages. Now let's also go to our about.php file, and let's, for example, say we want to access or we want to echo out session of user underline ID. And now let's go to our about.php. And as you can see, we're getting this warning, undefined variable $_ session. So somehow we're not able to access this variable. Why is that? In order to use a session on multiple pages, we need to start a session. So we need to use session underline start, like so. Now we started the session, so now we can access the session. Let's reload again. And we're again getting this error. So we also need to start a session on the page where we defined the session variable right here. So let's use session start again right here. We are first of all again going to our index.php file to initialize the session. Now we initialize the session, set our session variable. Now we can go to our about.php file. We have the session initialized. And as you can see, we can access the exact same session right here. So in order to use the session variable, you need to initialize the session. Then you can use the session by setting key value pairs instead of the session associative array. And then you can access this specific session from every single page. So you only have one single session, and this single session can be accessed from every single page. So by using a session, you can access values from different pages. And let me explain this in a little more detail, because this is really, really important. And I also want to explain a practical use case. So we can, for example, have this page right here. And this could be our login page, like so. And then we maybe also have our home page right here. And maybe there's just Instagram, so we have some stories right here. Doesn't really matter. Usually, if you use PHP, you obviously also have a server. So let's say the server is just this PC, for example. Where do you store a session? Usually you store the session on this PC. So once you use session start, you're going to call the server. You say, okay, we want to start a session. The session will be stored on the server. So each session has a unique session ID. And by using the session superglobal variable, you can store other values inside of the session. So the session will have an ID in our case. It will have a user ID as well, because we set it right here. If you say $_session of username, we are also going to add a username and so on. So all of the session data will be stored on the server right here. Then our server is going to reply and is going to send back the session ID. So the ID right here. And this session ID will now, under the hood, managed by PHP, be stored inside of a cookie. So we will have a cookie. Now we have this cookie that includes our session ID, and we have our session on the server that also includes the ID, but also has a user ID, maybe a username and a password. So on the server, we have all of the values, whereas we only have a cookie including the session ID within the client, so in the browser. Now, if we wanted to check whether we are logged in right now, for example, we could send another request, but this time we only have to send the cookie that stores our session ID, we take a look at our server. If we find a session that corresponds to the session ID that is stored inside of our cookie, we can just get the session data from the server and send it back to the client. So when you log in or register, for example, you first have to create a new session. Then you get back the session ID. The session ID will be stored inside of the cookie, but from now on, this cookie can be used to verify the user. So from this point on, you do not need to do an additional login because you now have this cookie to verify the user. Obviously, this cookie also has a certain time, so this cookie is only valid for a certain amount of time, and you can define this time later on, and we'll get to that. And after this time, this cookie is going to be invalid. So once this cookie becomes invalid, we have to log in again. We are going to create a new session ID. We are going to store the data inside of the session, and we will create a new cookie. We will send this cookie back, or we will send back the session ID that will be stored in a new cookie. And this session right here, so this session superglobal, allows us to access all of the values inside of the session. So really hope this makes sense. So to sum up really quickly, you first have to log in or register. If you register, you are going to create a new session on the server. The server replies with a session ID that is going to be stored inside of the cookie for every new request to the server. So if we want to get data, for example, if we want to get the session of user underline ID, for example, or the session of username, doesn't really matter, then we have to send a request to the server. We are going to send this request by sending this cookie within the request. The server will use this cookie, so the session ID that is stored within this cookie, whether the user is the user that he pretends to be. So we verify the session ID. If the session ID is valid, then we can, for example, give back a response that includes all of the data that the user needs, for example. So maybe his username, his user ID, and so on. And this data will be stored inside of the session variable right here. And now we could, for example, say that we're going to store the user ID inside of the session variable once the user logs in. And now we could, for example, check if this user ID session variable exists. If this variable exists, then the user is logged in. So if the user tries to access the register page, it does not really make sense because he is already logged in. So we can redirect the user depending on the session variable to the homepage, for example. And if the user tries to access the homepage, for example, but let's imagine he is not logged in currently, then we can redirect the user to the register page, for example. So by doing so, we can have protected routes that only allow the user to access a certain page, for example, depending on his permissions and his current session variables. So this is a really, really important concept. So maybe it was a little bit too much explanation, maybe it was a little bit too little, but I really hope you understand this concept because this is really, really important. And we'll also have a lot of examples later on, so if you don't understand everything yet, this is also no problem. But make sure to always start the session before using it. Now we are also having the server superglobal variable. So let me echo out server of request method, for example. I'm going to reload the page. We have in get, because usually if you fetch a website or a web page, this is a get request. If we submit this form, for example, that has a method of post, for example, we will get post, as you can see. So this variable, so the superglobal variable, so the server superglobal variable of a request method gives you the request method. And this can be really, really useful if you want to check, for example, if the request is in fact a post request. Because oftentimes if you submit a register form, for example, and the user would just input those values by using the URL on top, for example, so you could also just say username equals hello, pvd is equal to whatever, doesn't matter, then you could also submit this form without using a post request. And this would be a security issue. So it would make sense to check whether our request method is, for example, equal to post, and only if this request method is equal to post, only then we are going to do something. Otherwise, we are just not going to do anything. So this is a common use case. So server is really important. You can also output server of request URI, for example. Let's save that. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we are now getting /mpc/index.php because this is the request URI. And now we also have underlined files that allows us to access a certain file, for example. So let's say we want to submit a file by using the form. Then we can use input, file. The name can, for example, be avatar. So maybe we want to use an avatar or set an avatar when registering the user. And then we can access this avatar by using files of avatar right here. But it's really important that you also use enc, so enc type being equal to multipart form data. Without this attribute, you're not able to submit files within a form. So you have to set this one to be able to submit this file. So now let's echo this out, and this does not make too much sense. So let me show you. Let's choose a file like this. Let's submit. And as you can see, we are getting this array right here. So now we can access a key inside of this array, for example, or a key value pair by using the key again. So the key of name, for example. Let's reload the page. Let's choose a file. Let's say we are going to use do. We're going to submit. And as you can see, we're getting do.jpg. So this is just the file name. Oftentimes you maybe want to check whether a file has been set or not. So we are going to use if. And now we can say if it is not empty, for example. So empty is just a built-in function that checks whether an input is empty or not. If the input is empty, then this is going to return true. Otherwise, it's going to return false. So in our case, if this is not empty, so if underline files of avatar is not empty, then we can echo out not empty. Else we can just echo out empty, for example. Let's save that. So let's reload the entire page, probably MPC, we are getting empty. Let's choose a file. That one, for example, let's submit, and we're getting not empty. So by doing so, we can, for example, check whether the user has uploaded a file or not. If he has uploaded a file in a real world scenario, we could, for example, say, okay, now you can go on and upload the file. Otherwise, you have to upload something. So superglobals in PHP are really important. We will use a lot of them later on. So if you did not understand everything yet, we'll get to that later on. But I hope you just understood a little bit inside of this introduction. Let's understand validation and sanitization of input fields. Imagine we are having a form of type get, for example, and inside of this form we want to submit an email address. So we are going to use input of type email. The name of the field is going to be email, for example, doesn't really matter too much, and the action is going to be index.php. Now we also need a submit button, so a button of type submit that can, for example, have the text submit. So now we have this email field right here and the submit button to submit this form. So now we can submit this form, and it would work technically even though this input field, so this email field, is completely empty. So we need to make sure that this email field is valid if we want to submit this form, or if we want to do something with this data, for example. So maybe we only want to store this data in the database if the email is valid. So how can we validate the email, for example, or how can we validate input fields in general? And in order to do so, we can use validation and sanitization functions that are built in within PHP. So you can use filter, underline var, for example. Right here you have to pass a value. In our case, we want to check for an email. We don't have this email yet, so we need an email variable. So let's say email variable is equal to underline get, so the get superglobal variable, and we want to access the email input field. The email input field has the name email, so we need to access our input field with the name email, like so. Let's save that one. By using filter var, we are saying that we want to validate our email right here. And now we also need to define the filter we want to use. And we want to use filter. We want to validate, so filter underline validate. And right here you can see a lot of built-in functions inside of PHP. So by using filter bool, you can validate booleans. By filter validate email, you can validate an email, filter validate float for floats, and so on. So I think you get the idea. In our case, we want to validate an email, so we have to use filter validate email right here. And this right now will validate our email. And now we can implement some logic, for example. Let's imagine we only want to do something if our email is valid. So if filter var of email, filter validate email is true, then we want to echo out valid email, for example. Else we want to echo out invalid email, for example. Now let's reload the page. And as you can see, we're getting invalid email because at the moment we never submitted an email. So now let's submit an email. Email is again invalid. Let's submit a valid email, and we're getting valid email. So this seems to be a valid email right now. Maybe HTML also prevents us from submitting this email right here. But as you already saw, you can also just submit an empty input field, and this would obviously be an invalid email. But you could also use the parameters right here inside of the URL to submit an email. So this could be where, for example, and this would be a valid GET request as well. So this would be submitted to the server if you wanted to do that without validation. And you can also use something like Thunder Client, Postman, that allows you to execute post and GET requests, for example. So I could just go into Thunder Client right here. I could specify my domain. So I could say I want to do a post request to this endpoint, so to this URL, which is our URL right now. And now I could just enter this object right here. And I can say, okay, I wanna send the email as dsfsd, for example. So this is not a valid email technically. So I can send that one. And as you can see, we're getting status 200. So this is a valid request, and I could execute a valid HTTP request to this endpoint, even without using the front end right here. Also, all you really need to understand, front end logic is never meant for implementing any form of cyber security. Obviously, it's good if you have some feedbacks on your front end for the user to show him what the password should look like, for example, what the email should look like, and so on. But that is only to improve the experience of the user. That is not to make your web page secure. To make your web page secure, you always need to validate data within the backend, so within your PHP code. And one way is this filter validate function, for example, built into PHP. So as I already mentioned, there are a lot of validation functions within PHP, so filter, validate boolean, email, float, int, and so on. So you can always use the one that fits. Now there also exists a way to sanitize input. So we can also use filter var for email, and now we can say filter sanitize email, for example. And now let's remove this if statement as well as this echo and all of this right here. And let's just echo out this right here. Filter sanitize email in our case, for example, removes all symbols inside of the email that are not allowed within an email. So it sanitizes the email or cleans the email up. And there also exist a lot of sanitize functions if you take a look. So sanitize email, sanitize number float, sanitize number in, and so on. So let's sanitize our email. So now let's just enter an invalid email. So let's, for example, go ahead and use yapo at, and let's use those symbols right here, .com, for example. Let's try to submit. And as you can see right here, our HTML prevents us from using this symbol. So technically this is safe, right? As already mentioned, this is not a safe way, and we should never trust HTML. So the user could also go ahead, in our case, just copy this email, go in here to the URL and pass this or enter this as a URL parameter. So we can say email is equal. Now let's just copy this email right here. So yapo at, we are including those symbols right here, and we can send that one. And as you can see, this one was valid. And now by using sanitize, so filter sanitize email, we removed those symbols right here from our email. So our email has been sanitized. Also, I showed you this way to sanitize input, and from time to time you want to use this, but I also want to be honest, this is not something that you usually do. Using filter validate email is something that you will do pretty often, because you oftentimes want to validate your email before storing it inside of the database, because otherwise it wouldn't really make sense. But sanitizing input is something that you do not really want to do too often, and is something that is not really that necessary, to be honest, as well. A lot of people think that sanitizing your input before storing it inside of the database is somehow more secure than just storing it as plain text inside of the database, but that is actually not the case. It does not really matter how you store the data inside of the database. Sanitizing the input before sending it to a database does not really change anything regarding the security of your database, and that is what we want to get to next. So imagine we're having this email right here. We are sending this email to a database by using the submit button. And later on, imagine we are having a page where every other user can see our email address when we display a post, for example. The security risk only happens when we output this data. Now, you can, for example, imagine that a user just goes in, enters a script tag right here, for example. Instead of the script tag, he uses normal JavaScript code. So he could, for example, say alert, heyo, hacked, for example. And now he could just end the script tag, and he could submit this right here. Now this is an email field, so this is not valid, but let's just say this here is a text field, for example, and let's submit. And as you can see, we submitted this form right here. So technically, nothing really happened because we did not output this text yet. But now let's also say we are going to output our email. Instead of our app, we're going to submit, and now we're getting heyo hacked. So once we display this email within our page, we're executing the code that we inserted into this email field, and this code was just JavaScript code, and obviously JavaScript code within an HTML page is valid. So we are going to execute JavaScript code for every single user who is going to see this email right here on his page. And if you think about a blog page, for example, you always have like a username right here and you have a blog post right below. Every user who sees this blog post that another user has created, for example, will load this code right here. So every other user will execute this code and will therefore get this alert right here that we submitted right here. If you think about Facebook, for example, you could just write a comment right below an image, and every person who is going to load this image and is going to load the comments and therefore see your comment is going to execute your code, so your JavaScript code. So if you don't prevent this from happening, every user who is ever going to see this comment, for example, would be at a high risk of executing the JavaScript code that can potentially be malicious and therefore cause a lot of damage for a lot of different users. So we somehow need to make sure that this is not possible. So sanitizing data before storing it inside of the database is something that does not prevent cross-site scripting from happening. You always have to encode your output. So you always have to make sure that your output will be displayed in a safe format or safe way. And in order to do so, we can use HTML special chars. And inside of this function, we can just display our email. Let's save that. Let's again create a script. We're going to use an alert, hello. And now we're again going to use the closing tag right here. Let's submit. And as you can see right now, this script does not execute anymore, but we rather just see this as plain text. So HTML special chars should be used for literally everything where you accept user input that you want to display on your page later on. And you also have to think about it. Why is it important to essentially sanitize the output but not the input? Let's think about it. You're sending your username, for example. You're sending this to the server. We're not going to execute the code on the server. We're just going to store the code on the server. So if you're not executing any code on the server, there's not really a problem about it. We're just going to store it right there and nothing else happens. So even if you store potentially malicious code on the server, it's not a problem yet because we are not executing the code. When are we executing the code? We're executing the code when another user or yourself, but most of the time you want to damage other users. So when another user requests the page that contains malicious code. So maybe another user is on Instagram and now requests your profile page, for example. Within your profile page, the other user obviously also has to load your username, for example, because maybe that username will be displayed within your profile page. So now he loads this malicious code. He loads this potentially malicious code. So he's looking at this profile that includes malicious code. Now that he loaded this malicious code within his website, so within his front end, that includes HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code, he will execute this code, this malicious JavaScript code in our case, within his browser. And obviously this is something that is really bad for him. And that's the problem with cross-site scripting. So basically saving malicious JavaScript code to the server that will later on be executed in other users' browsers and therefore cause harm to them. So always make sure if you're going to output code that can potentially be malicious to use HTML special chars. So to sum up, you can use filter var combined with filter validate to validate input, and that is something that you should always do, especially for your email, for example. Then you can also use filter var combined with filter sanitize, and by doing so you can, for example, sanitize your email. That is something you can do. You do not really have to do that, and it's not that important, but in some use cases you might want to do that. And something that you always want to do when you want to output potentially malicious code within your website is using HTML special chars before including your value right here. And something that is also important right here is that you use ENT underline quotes and set this one to UTF-8. And this is something that you want to add to also make sure that XSS does not appear within HTML attributes. So this is more secure and is also something that you always want to add. Let's understand empty and is set in PHP. Imagine we have the variable age that can be equal to 0, for example. Now we want to check if the variable age is empty, for example, so age. If that is the case, then we are going to echo out empty. Otherwise, we are going to echo out not empty, like so. Let's save that one. Let's reload the page. And as you can see, we are getting empty because the variable age is equal to 0. So if a variable is either empty, so does not have a value, like so, or if the value is 0, for example, or if the value is an empty array, and so on, then we will always get empty. If the variable has a value though, like 12, then we're getting not empty, as you can see. And a variable is empty if it is 0, for example, as a number, 0.0 as a float, 0 as a string, if it's an empty string, for example, if it's null, or if it's false, or if it's not set. So if it's literally just nothing. So those are all the circumstances that result in an empty variable. Now you can also just use isset, for example, instead of empty, so isset of age. And now let's say we want to see if age of 0 is going to be set. Let's reload, and as you can see, we're getting empty. Why are we getting empty? Because we're checking, is our variable age set? If the variable is set, then we're echoing out empty. So in this case, we have to check if the variable age is not set. So if is set is equal to false, then we're going to echo out empty. Otherwise, we're going to echo out not empty. So isset does check if a variable is set in any way. So 0 is also a valid way. And a variable is only not set if the value is either null, so if it does not have a value, as you can see, so it can also be equal to null right here, and we will still get the same result, or if the variable does not exist at all. So let's delete age, and as you can see, we're getting empty. So by using isset, you check whether a variable exists at all, and by using empty, you're checking whether a variable is empty, for example. So empty is oftentimes used to validate user input fields, and isset is oftentimes used to check whether a superglobal is set at all. So we could, for example, check if is set. So oftentimes you, for example, check for a session variable. So for example, check if session of maybe last underline regeneration is set. If it is set, then you might want to do something, and otherwise you might want to do something else. So that is a use case where you oftentimes use isset. You don't have to remember this, you'll see this later on a lot though. Just want to make sure that you see this right here. And oftentimes if you validate user input, so if you have an input field, for example, inside of a form, so form of type post, for example, and inside of this form field, you have an input of type email, doesn't really matter. Then oftentimes you want to check whether this email is empty or not. So if the user has entered something, and then you can use if empty, for example, of underline post of email, for example, then obviously we also need to use this email field right here. And if this variable, so if the email is empty, then you maybe want to prevent the user from sending the form, otherwise he can send the form. So that would be a possible scenario when you want to use empty. Let's get to know phpmyadmin. In order to use phpmyadmin, make sure that you have XAMPP running right here, and especially that you have MySQL right here running. If it is not running yet, just press start right here. Then you can go to any browser you like, and inside of the URL right here, you can enter localhost/phpmyadmin. And this will get you to this dashboard right here, and it's a little bit too big. And this will get you to this dashboard right here. So to this phpmyadmin dashboard. To the left right here, you have all of your databases right now. And as you can see, I already have a couple of databases like login, bro, and so on. So those were all databases from previous projects. Now this panel on the top displays a lot of stuff, but actually most of this is completely unnecessary and I never used any of this. The only tabs that may be important are the databases and the SQL tabs. Let's take a look at databases, and as you can see right here, you can see all of your databases and you can create a database right here. You could do so, but there's also an easier way, and that is to just use plain SQL code right here. If you do not have a clue about SQL, I obviously recommend you to do an SQL course if you want to use PHP, but for now it's not that important and you can still follow along. To create a database, so a new database, instead of phpmyadmin, we're going to use create database, and now you can just give the database a random name. This can be anything. This could be this could also be this, and it could be NPC. So in our case, let's say we want to create the database NPC. I'm going to press go, and as you can see, we created the database NPC. Right now, to the left, you can see that we now have this database NPC right here, and inside of this database, we can now create a table. So let's say we want to use a database, we want to use NPC. So by saying use name of the database, we are selecting the database for which we want to define some operations right now. In our case, it's going to be the NPC database. And inside of this database, we now want to create a table, for example. So we can just say create table, and let's imagine we wanted to create a users table. So we can say users, for example, and every single user in this users table should have an ID. So we are going to say ID is of type int. It's going to be unsigned. We will have auto increment, and the ID is going to be the primary key. Again, this is just plain SQL. We also want to have an email. This email will have a varchar. Maximum character length will be 255 characters. It cannot be null, so we need a value right here, and it has to be unique, so we can't have the same email twice. We also want to have a password, for example, so pvd of varchar. Let's allow 60 characters for the password, and our password cannot be null. So this is a basic SQL query. Let's press go. We created the table. Let's click on NPC again, and as you can see, we can now see the users table. So again, for those who don't know SQL, you usually have a database. This database oftentimes is responsible for your project, so you create one single database oftentimes for one project, but you can also have multiple databases for a project. So that's up to you. But oftentimes, especially for small projects, you will have one single database for one project. Instead of this database, you can now create different tables. So you could have a table for all of your users. Then on your web page, you might have a store. So users can also order something. So you might want to have another table for your orders and so on. And every single table is responsible for one thing, for example. One table is responsible for storing all of the users. One table is responsible for storing all of the data regarding the orders and so on. And every single table then has a couple of columns, and every single column stores one specific value, in this case regarding the user. So the first column stores all of the IDs of the user. So the first user will have the ID 1, second will have the ID 2, third will have the ID 3, and so on. Second column stores all of the emails of the users, and the third column in our case stores all of the passwords of all of the users. So again, we have a hierarchy right here. Database stores all of the tables, tables store all of the columns. And every single row later on is going to be one entry. So every single row in our case is going to be one single user. If we have 10 rows, for example, then we have 10 users. User 1 might have the ID 1, the email ao@web.de, and a password of heyo. And I think you get the idea. That's how a database works. And phpmyadmin just allows us to manage the database that we want to create. So to manage our MySQL database. Let's understand the PDO connection. So last time we took a look at phpmyadmin, and now we might want to insert into this database right here. So obviously we could just use some SQL code to insert into users, for example, and then we can say we want to insert an email and a PVD. The values are probably going to be a@web.de, and the PVD is just going to be some random text. And we could just execute this query. And as you can see, now we should have a user inside of our users table. So let's take a look, and we have this user right here. But if you're using PHP, that is not really something that is useful, because we want to give a user the option to, for example, enter some input, so an email and a password into a form, for example, submit this form, and then the data will be stored inside of our database. So inside of this NPC database, inside of the users table. So let's just open localhost/npc. And let's understand how we can connect to a database. In order to connect to a database, we first need to define a data source name, so DSN, that is going to be equal to MySQL : Now we need to define the host. The host is going to be localhost because we're testing on our machine and we are using localhost right here. Then we need to define a DB name, so the database name. The database name is the name that we just defined previously. In our case, the name of the database is NPC, because that was the name that I've used. So DB name is equal to NPC. And now we can also say that the char set is equal to UTF-8 MB4. And this right here is nothing you really necessarily need, but it's definitely best practice, and I highly recommend you to define the char set right here. Now let's end this by using a semicolon right here. Now we also need to define a DB username. So the username that we've used for our database, for most of us this is going to be the root username, because usually that's the default username when you download MySQL. But you can also take a look at your user accounts, and right here I have root, for example. So this is the username, as you can see, And as you can see, the password is also no, so I did never set a password. So you can take a look at this tab if you're not entirely sure, but for me the username is root and the password is not set, so it's an empty string. So db username is going to be equal to root and db password is going to be equal to an empty string. And now to connect to the database, we need to say that we want to create a PDO instance. So this is going to be an object. So this is a variable in which we will store an object. So we are going to say PDO is equal to new PDO. This is a built-in class inside of PHP that will allow us to create a new PDO object. If you do not understand what exactly this is, we will get into object-oriented PHP later on. But for now, just remember that you can create an object by doing so. And inside of this constructor, you need to pass a couple of arguments to create a valid connection. First of all, we need the data source name, so DSN. So let's just pass DSN right here. Then we need to pass the database username right here as the second argument, so db username. And as the third argument, we have to pass in db password, like so. And obviously we could also just go ahead, delete this and enter the empty string right here and enter root right here, and this would work as well, but using a variable instead is a lot cleaner, so we are going to do that. And if we later decide that we want to change our username or our password, then we can just enter it here, and this is a lot safer and a lot easier. Now let's minimize this again. Let's go to our website and let's just put this PDO right here into a try catch block. Now let's put this PDO connection right in there. So we are trying to connect to our database. If that works, then we are going to echo out connection successful, for example. Else, so if we get an error, we are getting a PDO exception and the error, so the exception right here. And we're just going to echo out connection not successful. Let's just execute this code right here. And as you can see, our connection has been successful. Last time we created this PDO connection right here. And now let's try to insert into our database. Let's try to insert a user into our database. In order to do so, we're going to write some HTML code to allow the user to enter some input. So we're going to use form::post. For the action attribute, we will say that we want to call our index.php once we submit this form, because this is going to be the code that we want to execute. Inside of this form, we want to have an input of type email. The name is going to be email. And the placeholder is going to be email. Now we also want to have an input of type password. The name is going to be password and the placeholder is going to be password right here. Now we want to have a button of type submit to submit our form, and the text is just going to be submit. So this is going to be a super minimalistic form right here that just allows us to enter an email, a password and submit it to the server so we can store the user data inside of the server. Right here, we created our connection. So now we want to use this connection to write data to the database. First of all, we need to get the data inside of our PHP code. So we need to get our email and we want to store this email data that the user entered right here into the input field instead of this email variable. So what can we do? We want to get data from a post request. So we can use our post superglobal, the post superglobal of email, because that is the input field. And we also want to get our password. So underline post of password in our case. So now we have the email and the password data instead of our PHP file right here. And now there exist a lot of ways to insert code into the database. So we can create a statement, for example, and this is just going to be a regular SQL statement. So we can, for example, say we want to insert into our database. We want to insert into our users table right here. So if we go to our database NPC, we have this users table right here, and we want to insert into this users table by using PHP code right now. So instead of the statement, we are just writing plain SQL code. So we want to insert into users. What kind of values do we want to insert? We want to insert our username as well as our PVD, so our password, and we want to submit some values. And for now, let's just use some static values. So let's say for the username, we just want to say Ben, and for the PV, we are just going to say Ben1, for example. Doesn't really make too much sense, but let's test this. And now right below, we can just use our PDO variable that we've created previously, so our connection to the database. We can use this syntax right here, and we did not discuss this syntax right here yet, but this just says, for the PDO object, get me one of the properties. And the properties can obviously be a function inside of the object, for example, or can just be a key value pair, and so on. But we'll get into that later on. For now, just remember that by doing so, we can, for example, execute a function that is stored inside of this object. And the function that we want to execute is going to be query. And inside of this query, we need to pass the query that we want to execute. In our case, we want to execute this statement right here, which is just a plain SQL query. We're going to end this by using a semicolon. And I just realized that this field here is email and not username. So we need to change that. We need to say that we want to insert into users, and this is going to be the email and not the username. For simplicity, this is bennett.de. Doesn't really matter though. Now let's again go to our web page. Let's enter, or let's just press the submit button. We don't even need data at this point. So let's press submit. There was a reload right here. So let's go to our database. Let's reload the database. And right now we have Ben at web.de and Ben1. So we inserted something into the database, but right now it was a static value. So the user was not really able to enter a value right here. So you can also use single quotation marks right here, and you can input our email right here. So the email variable that we used right here, that we defined right here, where we used the post superglobal to get the value entered inside of the input field. And now we can do the same for the PVD. So we can say $PVD to get the value from our PVD variable. Let's again go to our website. Let's enter a random email, a random password. Let's submit. I submitted the form. Let's go to our page. And as you can see now, we have yapo@gmail.com and ASDASDAs. Whatever, doesn't really matter though. So now we stored the user input inside of our database. But I'm already going to tell you, I really want to make this short. This is a terrible way of storing data inside of the database because it's super unsecure. And the reason for this is that this code is really prone to SQL injections. So what is an SQL injection? Right now, imagine the user would just enter inside of this input field right here. Let me show you. Instead of this input field, the user could just enter plain SQL code. So I could, for example, instead of this password field, use drop database users, for example, or drop database whatever. So right now, let's take a look. We have this NPC database right here. Let me show you. I'm just going to enter this as the password. You're not seeing what I just entered, but this is essentially just this code right here. So I used this quotation mark, a closing bracket, a semicolon, and then this drop table users statement right here, followed by this comment initialization to comment out everything afterwards. So let me show you how this works. Let's execute the code. We're going to submit. We submitted. I'm going to reload. And as you can see, we don't have the users table anymore. So we just deleted the users table, or actually it was not us, it was the user who sent some malicious code to the database and therefore deleted our users table. And he didn't delete the database, he just deleted the table in this case. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, but I hope you get the idea. In this case, he did not delete the database, he deleted a single table inside of our database. But this is obviously bad enough, so this is something that we definitely do not want to happen. And in order to fix that, there exists something that is called a prepared statement. What a prepared statement does is it executes the SQL code, but it uses some placeholders for the parameters right here. So it does not insert the parameters directly, but uses a placeholder for the parameter, executes the SQL code, and once the code has been executed, then he is just going to take the values separately and just inserts the values to the right positions inside of the database. So it's not going to execute the statement, but rather just going to insert after the statement has already been executed with placeholders. So there's no way for a user to insert malicious code right there because we're just using placeholder text or placeholders in general to execute the SQL code. And only after the SQL code has been executed, only then we are going to store our real values inside of the database. And even if those real values now contain malicious code, it doesn't really matter because the SQL code has already been executed. And if we're not going to execute malicious code as SQL code, then it doesn't really matter because if we just store it inside of the database, it doesn't matter if it's malicious. It just matters once we execute malicious code. Just storing malicious code, again, is no problem at all. Only the execution is the problem. And I know I said this a lot, but I really want to make sure that you understand why this is important. And this is probably the most important part in this entire course, because this is really what makes your database safe and secure. And especially if you think about a banking app, the worst thing that can possibly happen is a user getting access, for example, to your SQL database and therefore to the data of your customers, for example. So this is really, really important. So how does this work right now? We can define a placeholder by just using a colon right before the placeholder name. In our case, let's say colon email and colon. So those values right now are placeholders. After we defined the placeholders, let's also delete that. We need to make sure that we bind the values. Also, I'm going to say that this here is my query because that might be a more suitable name right now. I also want to have a statement right now. This statement is going to be equal to PDO. I'm going to access a method from this PDO object. That is going to be the prepare method that just expects our query. So now we have this query, and this essentially just says prepare the query for us. So this statement now includes the prepared query. And now we also need to bind the values to the statement. So we can say statement bind value right here. We need to define the parameter that we used as a placeholder up to this point. This is colon email because that was the name that we defined right here for the placeholder. And we also need to define the value that we want to pass to this parameter later on. So this is going to be our email variable because this is going to be the value that the user has entered. Now we are going to do the exact same for our password. So we are going to say colon PVD because that was the value that we've defined right here for our parameter. And now we want to submit the PVD value later on to the database. And all we have to do in the end is going to say statement execute to execute this entire statement. So what we're saying right here is essentially first prepare the query. You can execute the query with those placeholders right here, but for now only keep the placeholders. Later on, after we executed the statement, so the SQL code, we are going to bind the value, email and PVD to those placeholders right here. So we are not going to execute some SQL code, we are just going to insert those values right here to the right positions inside of our database, and that's essentially it. So now we'll execute everything, and everything is going to happen as intended. And also if you use those placeholders, you need to remove those quotation marks right here. So let's get rid of them. Let's reload the page, continue. Let me enter some input, password, submit. Let's use an @ like so. Let's submit. Let's reload. Now we are having this user. And now let me again enter some malicious code. So the same code that we had previously, like so. Let me also enter a random email. Let me submit. And now we submitted the text. Let's reload. And as you can see, our users table is still there. We just inserted this malicious code, if you want to say so, into the database. But since we used a prepared statement, we never executed this code as part of SQL code. Therefore, we are just storing this code in the database, and that is absolutely no problem, as long as we are using prepared statements. So I know this can be a complex topic. I really hope you understood this as far as possible. You don't need to understand everything yet. We will get into more detail later on. Let's understand the CRUD operations in SQL. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. So CRUD is the short form for create, read, update, and delete. So today we will learn how to write data into the database, so how to create data, how to read the created data, how to update the created data, and how to delete the created data. Creating data could be creating a user in a database, for example. Reading data could be reading the user in the database. Updating data could be updating the username, for example, in the database. And delete could be deleting the user in the database. At the moment, we just have this PDO connection to the server right here. First of all, we need to create a query right here. So we say query is equal to insert into users. As you can see, we have this users table right here. Let's take a look. And as you can see, we have this users table that has an ID, an email, and a PVD. ID will be automatically generated, so we need to insert email and PVD. So we need to insert email and PVD. For the values, we need to define some placeholders because we want to have a secure query. So colon, email, colon, PVD. And let's end the statement by using a semicolon right here to end the statement instead of SQL, and another semicolon right here to end the statement instead of PHP. So now we have this query. Now we need to prepare this query. So we say statement is equal to PDO. So this PDO object that we have right here, that we created right here, we are going to call the prepare method of this object, and we are going to pass the query as an argument to this prepare method. So query right here. So now we prepared this query. So now we also need to bind the values to the defined params, so to the placeholders right here. So we say statement bind value to the placeholder :email. We bind the value email, and to the statement we also bind the value :pvd, or to the placeholder pvd we bind the value pvd. We don't have those values yet, so we need to accept those values. In order to accept those values, we also need to be able to get those values. So we need to give the user the possibility or the option to insert data inside of a form. So we say form :post to create a form that has the method post. And for the action, we need to define the file in which we defined the PHP code we want to execute. In our case, it's in the same file, so it's inside of our index.php, because once we submit this form, we want to execute this PHP code right here. So the code inside of the index.php. Now we have an input of type email, because we need to get an email. Name is going to be email. ID doesn't matter for now. And placeholder can be email, is not that important though as well. Input of type password has a name of password, and let's say for the placeholder that one's going to be password as well. Now we need a button of type submit to submit this form, and that one can just have the text submit. Let's reload the page, and as you can see, we are getting this minimalistic input form. And as you can see, we're also getting this warning right here. So let's get rid of this warning by saying if server of request method is going to be equal to post, only then we are going to execute this entire block of code right here. So we're accessing this server superglobal. We're taking a look at the request method. If we're just loading this page, the request method is usually a get request method, because fetching a page is a get request. So only if we have a post request, which we have inside of our form, because we defined this one as a post request, only then we're going to execute this code. So this query as well as those statements. So let's reload the page. As you can see, the error is now gone. And now after binding those values, we also need to say statement execute, because now we want to execute everything. Let's enter an email like so. And a random password, doesn't really matter. Let's submit. And you can see we are still having undefined variable email. The reason for this is that we did not get this value right here and pass it to a variable. So we need to create this variable email, which can be equal to post of email. And let's just place that inside of here as well. And now we can also get our PVD, which is equal to our post superglobal of PVD. Or in our case, I think it was password, because the name right here for our input field was password. Let's save that one. So we are storing the value of this password input field inside of the PVD variable as well. Let's reload, continue. Let's just use this as an email and this as a password. Let's submit. And as you can see, now it worked. Let me reload the database so you can see our last user had the ID 6. Let me reload. And now we have 7 and 8. So the users that we just created right now. And this here has been the last user. So creating now seems to work. Now let's also say we want to read the users. And we can keep our logic pretty similar. Let's just remove the password field, for example. And let's say we just want to have this input field where we can enter an email address. So we can enter the email, and then we want to find the user and output the entire user. So his ID, for example, as well as his password. And obviously in a real world application, you would not want to output a password. But I think for demonstration, this shows you how to read data from a database. So first of all, let's delete everything again, because I think writing everything out again is a good exercise or good practice. So we say email is again equal to post of email. Now we create a query and we're saying select everything from users where email is equal to email. But for now, we are again going to use a placeholder for our email to make this a safe query. And we're going to end the statement right here by using a semicolon. Now we are going to create statement and saying this here is equal to PDO prepare. We are going to prepare our query once again. We're going to use statement bind value to the email parameter or placeholder, we are going to bind our email value right here. And now we are going to do statement execute like so. Now we executed the query and now we are getting back data. So we can do statement and we're going to fetch and we're going to define a fetch mode. So we could, for example, say that you want to use PDO : fetch underline default. But in our case, we are going to use PDO : fetch associative. So fetch assoc, which means fetch associative. So we are going to fetch an associative array. And what does this line right here mean? By using this line, we are saying that we want to get an associative array returned. So our result now looks somewhat like this. So we have a username, for example. Then we have this array syntax. And right here, we have our username, for example. Afterwards, we are having a PVD, for example, and we're getting a random string as the password. And now we can say that we want to store this array in the user variable. So we could imagine that this here is going to be the user that we're getting back from our database that includes all of the information about our user. And now we could access one of those array keys by using user of username, for example, or PVD. So that is the benefit of getting the data as an associative array. And usually if you work with a database, you pretty much always want to use fetch associative because you want to get the data as an associative array. And now let me show you what this one here looks like. Let's just say we want to echo out. We're going to echo out maybe a break statement. So normal HTML code dot, and let's concatenate that one with our user of email, for example. Let's duplicate that line. So we have another break statement and now we're going to access user of PVD and maybe user of ID. So now let's say we want to get yapo@gmail.com. Try to remember the password and the ID. The ID is 5. So let me enter yapo@gmail.com. Let's submit. And as you can see, we're getting the user Yapo. So we read the user with the ID 5. Now we could obviously also just say that we want to fetch every single user. So we could create a query, for example, that is equal to select everything from users. So we're just getting everything from users. Now that is a query that we do not really need to prepare. So we could just say statement is equal to PDO like so. And we're just going to use the query method right here. We have to pass our query to this query method of the PDO object. So now we're just executing this query. Why do we not need to prepare the statement? We are not having any form of user input. So there's not really a possibility of having an SQL injection because the user is not able to enter any form of malicious code. So we can just execute this without preparing it. And now it's pretty similar to the previous solution. All we have to do right now is we can say we're getting the users and we are using stmt, so statement. We are going to execute the fetch all method of our statement object. And for the fetch mode, we are again using PDO : attribute error mode. So now we are having an array of associative arrays. So right here we are having user1, for example, who has username whatever, doesn't really matter. PVD doesn't really matter again. So something like this. And now we are just having for every single user one associative array inside of this array right here. So this array now is going to hold all of the associative arrays for all of the users. So now we can just loop over this array and we will get one user for every single iteration. So we can say for each, we're going to say users as user, for example. So we get one user for every single iteration. This user is stored inside of this user variable. And now we can just echo out maybe our break once again, like so. We are going to concatenate that one with our user of username. And let's say for now, we just want to echo out all of the usernames. So let me reload the page. And obviously this here needs to be PDO fetch associative, like so. And obviously this here needs to be email because we do not have a username in our database. So let's read it. And as you can see, we're getting all of the emails right here. So this is how you could read multiple entries from a database. Now let's also say we want to update a user that has a certain email. So we could keep this email field, but now let's say we want to update the email for the entered email. So we have one field for the email, for the current email. Now let's add another field for the updated email. So this field has the name updated email, for example, and the placeholder is going to be update email, for example. So now we have a second field right here to update the email. So first we have to enter our current email address, so hello@web.de, for example. Let's use that one. And for the updated email, we could use wayo@gmail.com. So how can we do that one? Let's just delete the current query. Let's again check if server of request method is equal to post. So if we are having a post request, then we're going to define a query that is equal to update users set email equal to email. So this email is a placeholder again, where email is equal to email, semicolon. And obviously this here needs to be the updated email. So we say set email equal to our updated email, where our email is equal to our email. So to this placeholder email. This placeholder email is going to be our current email, so the email that we enter right here. And this updated email is going to be the email right here that we enter to update the email. So we need to get both of those values right here by saying email is equal to post of email, and updated email is equal to our post superglobal of updated email. Next up, let's define a statement. That one is equal to our PO object. We are going to use the prepare method. We're going to prepare our query right here. Now we need to bind our values. So we say statement bind value to our placeholder email. We are going to bind our email value, and again statement bind value to our updated email placeholder. So this one right here, like so. We are going to bind our updated email variable, so the value that we have inside of this input field right here. Now that we bound both of those values to our placeholders, we can now use statement execute to execute the entire statement. And that is already it. So we can again just reload the page. Let's insert our email. As you can see, hello@web.de. That one is the email that we have right here. And now let's say for the new email, we want to use whoopee@gmail.com. We're going to submit. We submit it. Let's reload the page. So we should have updated this email. Let me reload. And we're getting for entry with the ID for whoopee@gmail.com. So as you can see, updating is pretty easy as well. Now let me show you how to delete a user. Again, let's get rid of this input field right here that has been used for getting the updated email, because we do not need that anymore. And now let's just say the user is able to enter an email, and we can delete the user with the corresponding email from the database. So we're going to again get our email, which is equal to post superglobal email. We're going to write a query. That query is going to be equal to delete from users. So this here should be delete, obviously. So delete from users, where email is equal to email. So again, we have a placeholder value right here for our email. So we need to prepare the statement. Again, we say statement is equal to PDO, prepare. We're going to prepare our query. We're going to say statement bind value to our email placeholder. We are going to bind the value of our email. And now we're just going to say statement, and we're going to execute. So statement, and we're going to execute our statement. Let's save that one. Let's reload the page. Let's say we want to delete the user with this email, because that one is pretty random. So let's insert that one. Actually, I didn't get that one. So, like so. Let me submit that one. We submit it. The user with the ID 8 should have been deleted. And as you can see, the user is gone right now. And it's as easy as that to create, read, update, and delete data. Let me introduce you to the header in SQL. So imagine we are having a form right here of type post that allows our user to submit or to press a button that just submits this form. So we say button submit to create a button of type submit. We're going to have the text submit, and the action is going to be index.php. So we're saying that we want to execute this code right here. Now let's again take a look if the server request method is going to be equal to post. And if that is the case, we know that we submitted this form, because right now we only have one single form on this page that has a post method. So it has to be this form right here that has been submitted. And if that is the case, then we can, for example, say that we want to redirect the user to our about.php. So we can just say header. And right here, instead of the header, you have to pass an argument. And this is a location argument. So you can say location, or you should say location, colon, space. And right here, you can define the destination. So we want to get to our about.php. So let's use a relative path. So relative to our index.php. We are on the exact same level. So we can just use the file name about.php to navigate to our about.php file. So now let me reload the page. We're getting this error right here because inside of our about.php, we try to include this /header.php, which is not inside a folder anymore. I think we previously had that one in a folder, so I'm just going to remove this // and now the location should be the right location. And as you can see, we are on our about page, but obviously that is not what we want. So let's just go to our /npc page. Now we have this submit button right here. And once we click on this submit button right here, we're going to execute this if statement, and specifically this header right here that sets our location to about.php. So I'm going to press submit. As you can see, we're getting redirected to our about.php page. Now let's imagine we are having a folder that is our pages folder, for example. And right here, we just have a page.php. Doesn't really matter though. And right here, I'm just going to have some boiler code and I'm going to have some random text in here. And now, once I click on this button, for example, let's say I want to get to this page right here. So I would have to define the file location to this page. So this file, the page.php, is instead of our pages folder. So we need to say pages. Let me delete that one. So pages/page.php, because that is now the relative path from our current page to this page.php file. Let me reload, submit, and as you can see, we land on our page. If we would be inside of our page, if we would be right here and we wanted to go to our index.php, we would have to use header, location, colon, .. because by using .. you're going one level up. So from this page right here, we are going one level up, and then we could navigate to our index.php like so. And it's as easy as that to use the header instead of PHP. So let's understand sessions and let's create a session instead of PHP. So right now, if we want to use the session variable right here, we first have to start a session. So if you want to access the session superglobal, always use session _ start before. So this right here is going to start a session. What happens once we call this function right here? So let me show you. First of all, we're going to create a session on the server. And now we can also access the session superglobal inside of our code. This session right here, in the beginning, once initialized, only probably has a session ID, for example, like so. So now if you log in, for example, you usually get the session ID from the server. You will store this session ID inside of the cookie. The cookie will be stored inside of your browser. And if you do another request now to the server, instead of sending your login data, so your username, email, or password, you're going to send this cookie instead that includes your session ID. You have the session stored on the server. You send this cookie that includes the session ID. And now the server knows, okay, the user with the session ID, so with this session ID, wants to request a certain page, for example. The server can immediately take a look at his own table and see, okay, that's the corresponding user, and he can return the data, for example, if the session ID is valid and the user is valid. Now someone is going to steal your cookie with the session ID though. He can also send this cookie with the session ID to the server. The server falsely thinks that this is the right user, the login user, and is also going to return the exact same data. Even though this user never logged in, he just stole your cookie. So if you're going to keep this session started and we never regenerate this session ID right here, then this user who stole your cookie would be able to act as if he was you forever. And this would be obviously a security risk. So it's good practice to regenerate the session ID from time to time. And a lot of people regenerate the session ID every 30 or 60 minutes. So let me show you how this works. First of all, we're going to take a look if is set if our session last regeneration property is set, then we're going to do something, and otherwise we're going to do something else. So let's first of all check if this session last regeneration variable is not set. If it is not set, that means that we just created this session right now. We've never set this variable right here at this point, so we need to set this variable for the first time and we need to regenerate the session ID. So we're going to use session underline regenerate ID, and we're going to set this one to true. This right here, this true, means that we are going to delete the old session ID and replace it with the newly generated session ID. So we had this old session ID right here. This one is now invalid, and we're going to have a new session ID, and that one is now valid. And now we also want to track when this last regeneration of our session ID has been. So we're going to now set this variable, this superglobal variable of $_session of last generation equal to the current time. So let's imagine, for the purpose of this example, that our time is just going to be 0. Obviously in a real world application, this would be something like December 21 and so on, 1543, doesn't matter. You get the idea though. But for simplicity, let's imagine time for us starts at 0. So now we're going to say else. So if this session last regeneration has already been generated, so if we have generated it right here, then we're going to define an interval. And this interval is pretty custom, so you can choose whatever you want, but as I said, 30 minutes is good practice. So we say 60 seconds times 30, because those are now 30 minutes, is going to be our interval. And once our current time minus our interval is going to be greater or equal to session of last regeneration, then we know 30 minutes have now passed. And now let's think about this. Let's imagine we generated this time right here. Time is now 0. 1 minute passes, time is now 1. Time is going to be 2, 3, 4, and so on, until we get to the point where time is going to be equal to 30 in this minimalistic example. Now we're going to have 30 minus our interval, which is also going to be 30 in this example, because we have 30 minutes right here. So once the current time is greater than this interval, so once the current time minus the interval gets greater than our initial time, so the time of our last regeneration, which has been 0, then we're going to regenerate this session ID. So I hope this makes sense, but you can also just think about it a little more and you'll definitely get the hang of it. So in this case, we're going to again call session underline, so session underline regenerate ID true, because we want to delete the old ID, and now we need to override our session superglobal of last regeneration and set this equal to our current time. So current time now, after we've called this for the first time, is going to be 30 in our case. Now again, we're going to have 30 for our last regeneration from this point on. Time is going to tick, and at a certain point we're getting to 60. 60 minus 30 again needs to be greater or equal to 30 in this case, which is the case, and then we're going to regenerate our session ID again. So I know this was a pretty simple example, but it works the exact same way with the real time. So I hope you get the idea. And as you can see, we regenerated the ID, and some of you might ask what is going to happen with the cookie. And obviously the cookie is going to be invalid once the session ID does not exist anymore on the server. So you could, for example, send this cookie that has the old session ID, but obviously that session ID does not exist anymore, so this cookie becomes invalid. If an attacker, for example, steals this cookie with the session ID, then this cookie with the session ID is not valid after 30 minutes anymore, and he cannot access your account therefore. Every time you regenerate the session ID, PHP makes sure that you automatically get the new cookie though. So if it is you, you're getting the new cookie, and a potential attacker would have to steal a new cookie again to get access to your account. Last time we understood sessions, but now it's also important to set some cookie parameters for the cookie that ultimately stores the session ID. So, as already mentioned, we have this cookie who stores the session ID for the corresponding session that is stored on the server. So we can set those cookie parameters by using session underline set underline cookie underline params, like so. And this method right here accepts an array. So we can pass an array as an argument. And right here we can now define a lot of different key value pairs that are all super important. So the first one is going to be our lifetime. This here is an associative array, so our lifetime can be equal to 0, for example. So this right here means that our cookie is valid as long as we are on this page, but once we quit, so once we close this page, the cookie will be deleted. And this is especially important for apps like banking apps, where you definitely want to log the user out, for example, after he exits the page. If you think about Instagram though, you do not have to log in on every single request, so it might make sense to have a super long session duration right here. So this is essentially a trade-off in the end between usability and security. If you need maximum security, this value should be as low as possible. If you want to have the maximum user experience, this value should be super high. Now we can also set the path key right here, and this one is going to be equal to a slash for us. This means the cookie is going to be valid for the entire page. So for all of the routes and sub-routes. So if you're having NPC, this is going to be valid. If you're going to have npc/contact.php, this is going to be valid as well. Index.php is going to be valid as well, and so on. So this cookie is valid for every single page and sub-page of this page. Now we can define a domain. We can just keep this empty, which means just use the current domain. For secure, we are going to use true, which means just submit this cookie via HTTPS. So this is also important for security. Now HTTP only is going to be equal to true as well. This just means this cookie is not accessible via JavaScript. This is a protection against XSS, so cross-site scripting, also important for security. And same site is going to be equal to lex in our case. And this is also super important for security because this is a good protection against something that is called CSRF. So imagine you're going on the web page wappa.com, for example. It doesn't matter. It's a random name, but you're just on this random page right here. And now you're maybe somewhere pressing a button. And if this is now a malicious website, this website could, for example, send a request to, let's imagine, your banking app. So to your banking app, and since every time you send a request to a page, by default, you also send all of the cookies. So all of the cookies that are stored inside of your browser, this banking app might think, okay, the user is still logged in. So this is a valid request. Maybe wappa.com requests via your banking app to transfer money to their bank account, for example. The request is valid because you're sending the corresponding cookie that proves that you're logged in, and therefore you're sending money by clicking on a button on a different page. And this is obviously something that is really, really bad. So by saying same, and this here needs to be same site, obviously. So by saying same site is equal to lex, you say the cookie is only valid if you send it from the exact same site. So if you send it via wappa.com, for example, this cookie is not going to be valid, and your banking app is therefore going to refuse this request right here. So same site lex is really, really important. And I really hope you understood this example. Otherwise, just feel free to take a short read online. But you can also just remember that you have to set this one, and then you're essentially good to go. Let's understand how to hash a password. So why do we even need to hash a password, and what is password hashing? Let's take a look at our database. As you can see right here, we have the email and the password. And the password has just been stored as a plain text. And obviously, if you think about an attacker who's getting access to your database, he could now just take all of the values. He sees email, he sees password, so he knows all of the login credentials from every single user in your database. And this is obviously a super, super big security risk. Imagine you would have something like this instead stored in your database. Now, even if someone would get access to your database, it's not really easy to use this random generated string to get the original password. So from this string, it's going to be basically impossible to get the original password. So now let me show you how this works. Let's say we are going to create another user once again. So this is again good repetition for us. So we have a form that is going to have a post request. The action is going to be index.php. So we'll execute this PHP code right here. Instead of this form, we have an input field of type email. The name is going to be email. The placeholder is going to be email, and we have another input field of type password. The name is going to be password, and the placeholder is also going to be password. We have a button of type submit to submit this form right here that has the text submit, for example. Let's reload the page. So this is the form that we have. And now we're going to take a look if our server request method is going to be equal to post. If the request method is going to be post, Then we're going to store this email and this password in an email and a password variable. So email is equal to our post superglobal of email, and pvd is going to be equal to our post superglobal of password, like so. Now we're going to create a query that is equal to insert into users email and pvd, and the values are going to be our email placeholder and our pvd placeholder, like so. We're going to end the statement and end the PHP statement. So SQL statement, PHP statement. We're going to use statement is equal to PDO. We're going to prepare our query right here the same way we did it previously. Now we're going to use statement. We're going to use bind value to our email placeholder. We're going to bind our email value, and to our password placeholder, we are going to bind our pvd variable. So this was the way that we've done it up to this point. So now let's just say statement execute, and we're just going to execute the statement. As you can see, test at web.de, random password. I'm going to submit. I'm going to reload the database, and we have test at web.de. So it works, but this here is plain text. So how can we now hash the password, and what is the hash? Let me show you. Let's first of all create a variable that has the name hashed password, for example, and this here is going to be equal to a method that has the name password underline hash. So this is a built-in method in PHP that accepts two arguments. So the first argument is our original password, so our variable pvd, and the second one is a hashing algorithm, so the algorithm, as you can see. And you can, for example, use password underline default. And this here is a default hashing function. And this default hashing function will always get updated by PHP. So this is always a hashing function that is pretty good and up to date. And at the moment, it should be bcrypt as far as I know. So you could also say password underline bcrypt, and this is equal to password underline default. So at the moment, PHP uses bcrypt as the hashing function because this is a good and secure hashing function. So what is even the point of hashing? As already mentioned, if an attacker gets access to your database, he can now read all of the passwords. If the password is hashed though, so now we have an attacker, but now he only has access to the hashed passwords. So now if you think about something like saying 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Now getting this value 2 by using 1 + 1 is super easy, right? But just because you have the value 2, you do not necessarily know that the original equation has been 1 + 1. So it's really easy to go from one direction to the other direction, but it's really hard to go from this point to the other point, right? And a probably better example is a phone book. In a phone book, you always have to the left a name and the corresponding phone number. So if you know the name, since a phone book is ordered by name, it's really easy to find the corresponding phone number. So if you know that the name is going to start with the letter A, then you can go to the beginning of the phone book and just search for the phone number. But if you just have the phone number, it's literally pretty much just guessing, because there's not really an order to the phone number in the book. There's only an order to the name. And if you just know the phone number is going to start with a 0176, for example, you could literally just go and look through the entire phone book, and maybe you might find the name at one point. But this again is just guessing, so this is not really time efficient. And the same goes for an attacker. If he gets access to your database, but only has the hashes right here, he literally has to guess the original password. So a password is super secure. So if you now want to verify this password, so if you want to log in, for example, then you would get the hash password from the database. So essentially this password in our case. And now you can use password underline verify past the password, so the entered password, so the password the user has entered when logging in, as the first argument right here. And as the second argument, you need to enter the string, and you get the string from the database. So this here is going to be the hash password. So this password right here is the password that the user enters when he logs in or when he tries to log in. And this right here is the password that you have stored inside of the database to the corresponding user. So the user might enter email and password to log in. Then you're going to fetch the user with the corresponding email. And obviously you have the hashed password inside of the database as well. So you can fetch the user with the corresponding email and get his hashed password as well. You also have the entered password right here. And now you can use password underline verify with the entered password and the hashed password from the database. Let's understand object-oriented programming in PHP. To understand object-oriented programming, we first need to understand classes. A class is a blueprint for objects. So we can, for example, create the class human. Now we have those brackets right here. And inside of those brackets, we can define properties for this human. So we can, for example, create a public property. So a public variable that has the name age, for example, and is equal to 24 or 25, doesn't matter. So what exactly is a class? If you think about humans, so you could say that we all belong to the class human, but every single human in itself is an object belonging to the class human. So what is an object? An object is essentially an instance that has specific values. So oftentimes the class defines what specific values belong to every single instance of this class, so to every single human, for example. So in a class, you usually define that a human should have a brain, that a human should maybe have a nervous system, that a human usually has a first name, a last name, an age, and so on. So the class says all of those things exist. And then you can create different instances of this class. So you can create a human that has the name Pascal, then you can create a human that has the name Jonas, then you can create a human that has the name Gabak, and all of those humans have different properties. So they have a different height, they have a different IQ, they have a different first name, a different last name, and so on. So class is the blueprint, object is the specific instance. And one class can be the blueprint for multiple objects, for millions of objects, billions of objects, or only for one object. That's up to you. But you can create as many objects as you want by using one single blueprint. And in our case, every single human, so every single human object would have an age of 25 because that is what we define inside of our class. And this here is a static value right here. We will get to dynamically assigning values to every single object later on. Also, you do not have to know what public right here means yet. We will get to that later on. Inside of a class, we can also define a method because obviously a human does not only have properties like a height and IQ, a human can also do stuff. A human can walk, a human can think, a human can punch. So let's create a function punch, for example. So public function punch, brackets for our parameters, brackets for the function body, and now we can just echo out punching. And that's it. So this here is a normal function. As you can see, the function syntax is completely normal. The only difference is that we have a visibility modifier right before the function keyword. And again, we're getting to that later on. So instead of the class, we can define properties and we can define functions. Properties define a certain property of that instance later on, while functions defines what the certain instance can do later on. So what one human can do, for example. So right now, we could create a human by saying our human, so maybe human1, is going to be equal to new human, and by doing that we are going to construct a human right now. And now we could also create a second human, so we have human1 and maybe we also have human2, and both of them are just a new human. By saying new followed by the class name followed by those brackets, you always call the constructor, so you construct a specific instance from the blueprint of this class. Now we can access the properties and methods, so functions inside of this object, by saying human1, so the instance name, for example, we could also use human2, but in our case, let's just use human1. Now we're going to use this arrow right here, and by using this arrow, we can access properties and functions. So in our case, we could access the function punch, like so, and this will execute a function punch for human1. And as you can see, we are getting punching right here. Now we could also duplicate this line, and we could say human2, and human2 should also punch. But as you can see, we're just getting punching, and there's not really a difference. So every human is the same. And if you think about the real world, every human is basically different. Not every human is the same. So it would make sense to be able to set those properties right here dynamically, for example. And in order to do so, there exists the constructor to define different properties for every single human in our case, for every single construction essentially. So every time we construct a new human, we give this human a couple of properties. I know this is a weird example, but if you think about a baby getting born, you also basically construct a new child. And by constructing that one, this child will also get a couple of properties like height, intelligence, and so on. And a constructor is pretty much the same. To create the constructor, you have to use public function. So the constructor is just a function, underline, construct, like so. And as you can see, it automatically generated this constructor for us already. So this is just a normal function. And now let's say we want to set this age right here dynamically. So we're going to remove the value right here. We will say this, followed by this arrow right here, pointing to the variable age. This one is equal to, and what should this age be equal to? When we construct this human, new human, we're essentially calling this constructor. So we can also give this constructor, since it's just a normal function, properties. So a property could, for example, be my age, for example, or human age. And now you can say that this age is going to be equal to human age. So now we can pass, or we have to pass, an argument to this function like 25 and 29. And now human number 1 has an age of 25 and human number 2 has an age of 29. So how exactly does this work? Right here we define a function. We call this function by saying new human. We can pass all of the arguments instead of those brackets right here. So those are the arguments that we define right here as parameters for the constructor. Now we say that this age is going to be equal to the age that we pass to this constructor right here. So right here. But what exactly is this age? So what is this, first of all? This always points to the object that has been constructed by using this constructor. So we are calling this constructor for human number 1. So for human number 1, this points to the object that has been constructed by using the constructor. So for human number 1, this points to human number 1. So human number 2 calls the same constructor, and for human number 2, this now points to human number 2. I know this sounds pretty complicated, but this always just points to the object that has been created by using the constructor. So for human number 1, this points to human number 1. For human number 2, this points to human number 2, and so on. So basically every single object has a this pointing to itself. And now we just say this object that has been created using this constructor right here will have an age that's equal to the age that we passed as an argument right here. And now a convention that you use pretty often is that you just use the same name right here. So you just say this age is equal to age. And this age right here is the parameter, and this age right here is this age variable inside of the object. And I know objects and classes sound a lot more complicated than they really are once you work a little bit with them. So now, nevertheless, we have this age, and now we could also say that we want to have a name, for example. So we can say public name, and let's also set the name by accepting a name parameter right here. And now we can say this name is equal to name. Let's end the statement. So now our human has an age and a name, and we can set age and name dynamically. So human number 1 could have the name Jonas. Human number 2 could have the name Wayo. So now we have two different humans, two different instances of the class human. And now it might make sense to also use those variables right here instead of the function. Now, instead of this function punch, we can also say that this name dot to concatenate is punching, for example. And now this again references the object that is calling this function. So when human 1 calls the function punch, this references human 1, so the name of human 1. And if human 2 calls this function, this references human 2, because human 2 is calling this function. And basically this name references the name of human 2. So now let me just save that. Let me delete human 2 for now. So we have human 1. Human 1 should have the name Jonas. So we should get Jonas is punching once we reload. And as you can see, we're getting Jonas is punching. Let's also use human 2. So now we should get Wayo is punching. And as you can see, we're getting Wayo is punching. So now by using those lines of code, we are able to create as many objects as we want. And every single object has a slightly different functionality. And obviously this is just a super simple example, but you really get the idea. If you think about a computer game, for example, you could now create 100 humans, and every single human could have a different amount of damage, a different IQ, a different speed, and so on. And this would make your computer game a lot cooler, for example. So classes are really, really important and powerful. But there's a lot more to classes, so let's go. Now imagine we want to create a hero. And a hero is just a human, but it's basically a strong human. So it wouldn't really make sense to define all of the stuff that we have for our human once again, if we have this blueprint already. And we just maybe want to add one more function for a hero. So in that case, we can use inheritance. We can do so by saying class hero. Now the hero class can inherit from our human class by using x_tens followed by the name of the class it wants to inherit from. So from human. Now we're going to use those brackets once again. And maybe a hero also has a power. So let's say public power. This is going to be another variable, so another property instead of our hero that a human, for example, does not have. Again, we need to use a constructor. So we say public function underline construct. And as you can see, PHP automatically created this constructor right here. So by saying parent underline construct followed by age and name, we are calling the parent constructor and passing the parameters right here to the parent constructor. Let me show you. Now we're just going to create a hero, 1 for example, who is equal to new hero. We will pass an age to the hero, so maybe 31, and a name, so maybe Saitama. So now we are creating hero 1 by using the hero constructor. So we are calling this function right here. We are passing age and name to this constructor function. And now we're using this age and this name to call the parent constructor. The parent constructor is the human constructor, so this constructor right here. So we're just passing those values to the parent constructor, using them for the parent constructor right here, so that we can, for example, now use the punch function that we inherit from the human with the right values. Now if we also want to add the power property though, then we have to add another value right here. Then we have to add another parameter right here of power, for example. And again, we just have to say that this power is equal to power again in our case. So right here, we're defining a new value for our hero class. And we're also calling the parent constructor, so the human constructor, with the necessary values for the human constructor. So for the parent class. So now let me delete those humans right here. We don't need them anymore at this point. And now our hero also needs a power. So let's maybe say 1000. And now our hero 1 can do all of the things that a normal human can do. So hero 1 can punch, for example. So let's call punch right here. Let's reload the page. Saitama is punching. So Saitama is also able to punch, because Saitama can do anything that a normal human can do, but Saitama also has a power. So let's use this power to create another function that is specific to a hero, so that only a hero can do. Maybe we want to say public function kick, for example, so only a hero can kick, humans can only punch. Then we want to use those brackets right here, and we want to echo out this of name maybe dot is punching with a power of, again, let's concatenate, and let's again use this power. So let's now also call hero of kick. We're going to execute that, and as you can see, and this needs to be hero 1, like so. Let's reload, and as you can see, Saitama is punching, and let me delete that so we see it a little bit better. In this case, he might be kicking, might make more sense. Let's reload. So Saitama is kicking with a power of 1000. So now a hero can punch and a hero can kick, because a hero is basically just a human that has some special powers in our case. So they can just do a little more than a human. And another example that you can imagine is an animal, for example. So you have an animal. This is going to be a parent class. And now you have a lot of individual animals. So you might have a dog, you might have a cat, you might have a bee, and so on. So all of those animals right here are somehow animals. So they have certain things in general, but all of them are also slightly different. So it might make sense to create a base class animal, and then every single individual animal, so the dog, the cat, and the bee, can inherit the basic properties from the animal class, but can also define some new properties that are individual to, for example, dogs, cats, or bees. And that is the purpose of inheritance. Now let's also understand what this right here means. So public and so on. So what values can we use right here? This here defines the visibility. And this can have the value public, private, so private, and also protected. So those are the possible values. If I'm going to say that this function right here, so the function kick, is going to be public, then as you can see, I can call this function right here. And the same goes for the power. So if I'm just going to say I want to get the power, for example, you can see that we can access that right here. So now I could echo out the power of our hero. So we are getting the power. Now I could also say that our power should be private, for example. Let me save that one. And now we're getting an error because private properties can only be accessed within this object. So I could, for example, say that I want to create a public function show power, like so. And I just want to echo out this power. So now we are just using this public function to echo out the power. So let me call it one for our hero, like so. Let's reload. And as you can see, now we're seeing the power. So the power right here can only be accessed within the class. So within those brackets right here. So this is the beginning and this is the end. And only inside of this class you can use the power right now. So you could, for example, use the power to do some calculations or do whatever you need. But you cannot use the power outside of this class. So you cannot access the power outside of this class. You can only access it within the class. And usually, if there's not a need to have this public, you always want to use private. Only use public once it is definitely necessary to use public. Now, let's just say that this here is private as well. And let's say that this is private as well. And as you can see, now we're getting this error right here, because now we said that we can only access those properties within the class human, but we cannot access those properties anywhere else. So now we cannot access this property right here instead of the class hero, for example, even though this is just the child of our human class. So private really encapsulates everything within this single class. If you want to access those properties, for example, instead of child classes, then you might want to use protected. So protected is similar to private, but protected means that child classes can also have access to those properties, but those properties cannot be accessed outside of the class or outside of child classes. So we could not access the property right here, but inside of the child class, as you can see, it works. So now we're not getting this error anymore. So public, you can access it from anywhere. Private, you can only access the property within the class. Protected, you can access the property within the class and within all of the child classes. So all of the classes that extend the initial class. And as I said, you always want to have a private property if possible. So let's also just delete all of this because this is a little bit easier to read then. And let's delete that. So now we have this basic code. But now imagine we wanted to get the power outside of this class. Or maybe we want to set this power outside of the class. Obviously, you could just say that this here is public again. But this is not really a good practice. Usually you want to use getters and setters for that. So you want to use something that is called a getter to get the value or a setter to set the value. So you want to use getters and setters outside of the class to access this value that is private. Let's start by creating the getter. And a getter is just a normal function again. We're going to say public function get power, for example. We're going to create the function body. And right here, we are just returning our power value. So we're just returning the value. And obviously, we need to say this power. Now we're returning this power, the power of the human. So we can, for example, say for hero 1, we want to echo out hero 1, and we want to access get power. Let's reload the page. We're getting again 1000. So the power is 1000. So this right here is a getter. Now we also want to create a setter by saying public function set power. But right now we need to accept a parameter because we want to give the user the possibility of setting the power. So this one can be power as well. Doesn't really matter too much. This can also be NPC. And I'm going to use NPC to just show you that this works. So at this time we do not want to return the power, but we want to set the power. So this power is now equal to NPC because that is the parameter that we are accepting right here. And usually, again, this is going to be power. So it's a convention to just use the same name. But to really demonstrate how this works, I want to use MPC right here. And now we're going to access hero1. And let's also echo that out so we see the difference. So let's access hero1. And now we want to set the power. And as you can see, it expects this MPC parameter as an argument right now. So let's say our power level is now 9,000. Let's set the power level to 9,000. Let's echo the power level out right below. And as you can see, now we're getting 9,000. So even though this variable is private, we can use getters and setters to get the power level in our case and to set the power level. And usually you want to keep your variables, so your properties, private, and you want to create getter and setter properties if you want to get and set the property. And this is just a coding practice. This is also called encapsulation, and that is something that you want to do since it's just best practice.